Good evening all and welcome, and thank you all so much for being here. It means a lot that you choose to watch this channel. I have a chilling collection of scary stories in the rain for you to enjoy, but for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. A few years back, I was working for a company. I would put so many work hours in an attempt to climb the career ladder, and all of those hours were unpaid, of course. I used to use my lunch breaks to catch up on sleep. It became routine for me to pull into a quiet area, eat lunch, read a bit, and have a sleep. In my evenings, I would always visit clients, and that meant that from lunchtime till early evening, my bosses assumed I was traveling. It was a little dishonest to sleep on the job, but I was so tired from working overtime, and my company were ignoring the labor standards law. I never managed to sleep deeply in the car, so I guess that's why sleep paralysis soon found me. It was a cold day in December when it happened. I was en route to a client's, and I found a great area to pull into to take a nap. I found a vacant plot of land by a dam, a blind spot from the highway behind some bushes, ate, reclined the seat, and read. And before I knew it, I was asleep. When I opened my eyes, the LCD display screen in my car displayed a track and the time. It was 6:05 p.m, and I think Radiohead were playing. I remember thinking, "Oh, you idiot, you overslept." I went to put my chair back into position, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, and the atmosphere in the car was dark. My eyes were fixed on the windscreen. I could see something dark in the upper hand right side of the windscreen. It was a shadow of a human hand. The time changed on the LCD display to 6:06. My eyes hurt for some reason. I looked back to where the hand was, and there was now a shadowy head peering down at me. I couldn't make out any facial features. It was just a black silhouette, with one hand resting in the middle of the windshield. It was staring at me. Even though I couldn't see its eyes, I knew that it was just staring at me, observing me like I was a fish in a fish tank. While it was staring at me, I felt intense feelings of anger and unbearable waves of sadness. I'd heard stories about people feeling these feelings when in proximity to the paranormal, but I'd never believed it. It's like you sense someone's final emotions. It was unexplainable. I couldn't move. I was just face to face with this dark shadow. I was asking myself if I was asleep or not, and was trying to figure out what the shadow was. A lot was happening. All the while the shadow was staring at me without a single form of slight movement. I had the ability to move my eyes, but suddenly I was unable to. All of the surrounding colors in the car and outside the windows faded away. I couldn't see my book anymore, and the LCD clock disappeared. I was slipping into darkness. It was terrifying. Then I heard a knock. It was against the window. My fear was now at its peak. I still couldn't move, and now something was trying to get in, or at least make its presence known. Then I realized that it was a knocking sound. Hearing it louder the second time, I was suddenly freed from the bounds of sleep paralysis. It was bright out, and I looked at the clock. It was 2:30. Nowhere near the 6:05 p.m. I saw earlier. I heard the knock again. It wasn't part of the nightmare, though, I had just been through. I looked out of the window and saw two shadows. The sunlight was obscuring their faces. I put my window down and shielded my eyes. Two police officers were stood in front of me. One looked 30, the other 50. They announced themselves. I was disoriented and a bit on edge, so perhaps I was a bit rude, and said something like, "What's the problem?" "What are you doing here?" the older officer replied. "I was just taking a nap." "What's wrong? Is this private land or something? I didn't mean to trespass." "No, that's not the problem. As you know, we're in a recession at the moment. You come here to this place alone? We're just making sure you're not doing anything stupid." I asked him what he was implying. "Sir, have you come here to take your own life?" I told him honestly that I just pulled over because I'd been so tired at work, but I wasn't going to do anything like that, and I apologized for giving them that impression. I could have never been ready for his response. "Sir, with the greatest of respect, we saw what you were doing in your car. You were strangling yourself to the point that your eyes rolled back. Are you sure nothing's wrong?" I was completely floored by this statement. After a while, I managed to convince myself that I was going to be okay, and said that I would get some rest, and they wouldn't have to worry about me, and that I wouldn't be coming back. I got out of there as fast as I could and headed back to the office. I called the client and asked if they were okay with a phone consultation, and they were. I didn't want to be alone. I left that damn area feeling truly terrified. Since that day, I didn't want to take naps in my car again. Every time I would feel tired, I would just remember that shadow and what the officer said I had been doing in my car. I slipped into a light form of depression due to lack of sleep, stress, and it was affecting my work. I was the bottom performer. Within a month of seeing the shadow on my windshield, I left my job, and no one complained or cared. I was saving myself from being fired, to be honest. I didn't know what that shadow was, but recently I'm not so sure if it was paranormal or not. I just think I had a scary dream brought on by my tiredness and the state of mental health at the time. At least, I tell myself that. For better or worse, it got me to leave my company and prioritize my health. I'm a bit frightened that the shadow will come back one day if I enter another period of unhappiness in my life. My physical and mental health wasn't that good. That's perhaps why sleep paralysis came for me. To anyone out there listening, take care of yourself if you can relate. Mental health and a work-life balance are important and underrated. I have a few stories I'm going to share. I work at a nursing home and would pick up extra shifts on my days off, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., or would sometimes work doubles. I worked on 2 wings. One night, while working in the West Wing by myself, it was around 3 a.m., and I heard a wheeled walker, the kind with the wheels on the front and the little rubber stops on the back, coming up the hallway to the nurse's station. Thinking it was a resident wanting a pain pill, as some of them would walk up instead of ringing their call bell, I sat and waited, hearing the walker wheels on the tile hallway floor. And after a while, I thought to myself, they should have made it to the nurse's station by now. It's not that far of a walk. I got up from the desk, looked out to the door into the hallway, and nothing. There was no one there. As soon as I stood up and got close to the doorway, the noise stopped. I was so confused that I did rounds, checked on every person in every room, even empty rooms, and every resident was asleep, and every empty room was just that, empty. One evening, between 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. shift, 2 other aides were with me, sitting at our round table, chatting in the front room. This is within the nurse's station. Our nurse's station is split into 2 rooms with a big open wall between them. We have a very large med cart right inside the second room of the nurse's station, and you can see it from the round table. It's diagonal from it, right through the doorway. And we're all talking when all of a sudden we hear a weird scraping noise. We all look over towards the med cart where it was coming from, and our styrofoam cup full of plastic spoons went flying off the med cart with force, strewing the spoons all across the room. I got up and put the cup back. The cup had Velcro on the bottom and was Velcroed to the top of the med cart, so when we pushed the cart around it didn't tip up and spill. I picked them up and put them back. I tried hitting the cup to see how easily it could get knocked off, but it couldn't. You literally had to use force to pick it up, and you couldn't knock it over. We were all so excited and there were only 20 minutes left of our shift, and we couldn't wait to leave that night. I was then working on a different wing for a while. There was a room in this wing called the Blue Room, which was 4 doors down from the nurse's station, on the same wall of the nurse's station. I was with a co-worker almost finishing our shift. It was around 10 p.m, and there's a piano in the Blue Room, and I kid you not, it began playing. It was quiet, as if someone were barely pressing on the keys. I got up, thinking one of the residents got out of bed, couldn't sleep and wanted to do something, and they're allowed access to this room at any time. The closer I got to the room, the more quiet the piano played, until I got up to the room and turned on the light. As I did so, it immediately stopped playing. I stayed close to my co-worker and vice versa for the rest of our shift. During a day shift around 1 p.m. or so, every room has a call bell. They're just like a light switch with a small hole in the actual switch part, with a long sturdy string attached, so that the string can reach their bed, chair or floor in case they fall over or need something. To switch it on or off, you have to give it a good yank or it won't switch on. When switched on, the call bell rings loudly. You can hear it the whole length of the long hall, and we have a lighted number board right in front of the nurse's station on the opposite wall, so that when we're at the station sitting at the desk, we can see it right in front of us. Whichever room call bell is flipped on, it will blink on said room number on our board. All doors also have a pretty big light right above them. If the resident's call light is on, this light will also blink. Residents just got back from lunch, and room 126 call light is going off. I got up, then thought to myself, room 126 has no one in it anymore. He had recently passed away about a month prior. I thought maybe someone walked into the wrong room, but who knows? Old people do weird things sometimes. Or maybe someone from maintenance was doing something and needed help. Some of my residents do have early onset dementia and Alzheimer's, and sometimes forget which room is theirs. I go to the room, go to open it, and it's locked. I get the keys out my pocket, open the door, and all the lights are on, and the call light is still ringing/turning on. I turned off all the lights and the call light. I thought maybe the string got stuck in/around the small nightstand below it, causing it to turn on. The small nightstand was the only furniture in the entire room. Family left it for us to reuse as they didn't want it. I moved the dresser to the opposite wall to make sure there was no AC or heat turned on, and took the string off the call bell. My boss heard it go off. Her office is right next to the nurse's station on this wing, and asked me if whoever rang it was okay. I said yes, and explained what happened. Not even a minute after my explanation, it started to ring a second time. Same exact thing. I went to the same room, unlocked the door. The lights were all on, even though I know I turned them off, and the call light was ringing. I flipped the switch, turned off all the lights, locked the door and shut it behind me. My boss followed me in this time, and was just as unnerved as I was. Nothing more happened, and we got a new admission that next day that moved into the room. The next and final thing was one of the creepiest I've ever encountered. Black-eyed creeping teenagers, but we'll get to that. You see, we had a double room with 2 people in it, a mother and daughter. The mother was 98 but in pretty good health, besides a fall the year prior and her diabetes. The daughter was 66 and had small seizures/epilepsy and would have falls often. They both moved around pretty well with their walkers though. Their call bell went off one night, but only for a few seconds, just long enough for me to look up and look onto the call light board to see the light flashing for their room number, which was 133A, for the first half of their double room, where they have a living room set up. If the light went off for 133B, That would have been the second half, either the call light in the bathroom or in between their beds. I went back to check on them. They were both sound asleep, snoring, and the last time I did rounds at midnight, they were asleep then too. I brushed it off as a malfunction or something. I short-shifted myself, so I was working a double, and had worked this said night from 11 to 7 a.m., then working into the next day 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. I got off an hour early for picking up this shift, since we were short-staffed. So it's now 7 a.m. and I start doing my rounds, waking everyone up, starting at the top of the hall, room 121, and going to the clear end of the hall, room 133. I go to the mother-daughter room and wake them up. They're both already awake, which is unusual. They like to stay up later than most of my residents and have a hard time getting up in the morning. I wish them good morning, go get the mother's check to see how her sugar is and how much insulin she'll need. And she begins telling me, "You need to tell Elsa those teenagers to stop crouching down at our living room window all night." Mind you, this is the only 98-year-old I've ever met with a mind so sharp. She was still 100% completely with it, and I asked her to elaborate and tell me what happened. She said that every night this week, right when they crawl into bed, they can both see shadows outside their living room curtain and can hear people knocking and tapping on the glass. They can hear them having conversations with each other and laughing excessively, sometimes for up to 5 minutes continually. She told me it's 3 teenagers. She said the first night it happened, they kept saying, "Please let us in. We're cold, and we need to use your phone and call our mum." She also said that last night she got up out of bed and turned on the light and looked out the window. She was going to yell at them. She could see their shadows standing up only inches from the window, and when she went to open the curtain, they crouched down again underneath it. She also explained that the previous night, when she opened the curtain for the first time, she only turned on the small lamp on the other side of the room and saw their faces peering in the window before they ran away faster than she's ever seen anyone run. She explained their clothing looked 90s style, and their eyes were completely black, saying that it looked like one giant pupil instead of a pupil with color around it. She was very adamant on what she saw and never changed her story once, and her daughter backed this up, saying that she saw and heard them too. The next night, a co-worker messaged me on Facebook at around 12:20 as I was off, saying that I needed to call her ASAP. I called and she explained to me that she got caught up counting meds and didn't start her midnight until 12:10. She said when she got to room 133 she heard a tapping on the glass. Knowing what these 2 women have been claiming has been happening to them at night, and she opened the room door the rest of the way and quietly walked in. She got to the window and saw the same teenagers that the residents described, walking away from the window up towards the street, except she said they weren't totally opaque. It was almost as if they were muddy or blurred, and not human. She was so scared that she had called security to come sit with her the rest of her shift, and our security officer did just that. After that week, my co-worker was the only other person besides the mother and daughter, and the last person to ever see those teenagers with black eyes and blurred bodies. After sitting with my co-worker that night, the security guard started patrolling between 11 to 1 a.m., but the teenagers were never seen again. I saw a shadow person once. I didn't know that's what it was until much later. I was living in a house in Laguna Beach that had been there since the 1920s. In its history, it had been a speakeasy, a brothel, and a house for smuggling illegal immigrants. One day, my new wife and I were having an argument. I can't even recall what it was about. She walked down the block to get a cup of coffee and cool off, and I was home alone in the house. The way the place was built was incredibly haphazard. There was a bedroom and living room on one side, then a bathroom with 2 entrances on the other side. On the other side of the bathroom was a hallway that had windows in one side and 2 bedrooms on the other. From my bedroom, I could look across the hall into the bathroom, then through the bathroom and down the other hall. I was standing at my dresser, and I just noticed movement from the corner of my eye. I looked down, and there was, honest to God, a black figure. It gives me chills just remembering this. It was about 3 feet tall and vaguely humanoid. It looked like a black scribble, like someone had scribbled a human shape, but the scribbles moved, like electricity arcing. That's the best way to describe it. There was no sound that I could remember. I distinctly remember when I saw it, I wasn't afraid, I was just like, what? Then it noticed me looking at it. I can't say it turned around, it just focused on me, and then I was scared. I didn't move, I didn't scream, nothing. I was just frozen, because it just came at me, rushing down the hallway towards me. I have no idea what it intended, but as soon as it entered the bathroom, the door closest to me just slammed shut on its own. Then I screamed. I yelled for my wife. She wasn't home, and I went the hell out into the daylight and didn't go back until she got home about 10 minutes later. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe I saw something supernatural. But I do know I saw something. I just don't know what it is. My family, especially the children, have always been bothered by paranormal activity. My mom, dad and I gained guardianship of my nephew, Memphis, when he was a newborn. He never had any trouble sleeping by himself until my dad passed away and we had to move in with my older brother in Oklahoma. He was immediately terrified of the bathroom, closet, and to sleep alone. He was around 6 at the time, so could somewhat articulate what he was seeing. He always referred to it as the smiley guy. Creepy as hell, I know, and when we asked him to draw this smiley guy, what he drew was a brown monster-looking thing with a sharp, bloody smile. As I mentioned before, we were living with my older brother Dusty. He also had a son, Leyland, but was much younger than Memphis, so couldn't really explain what he was seeing, only described it as the Grinch, and would get so scared and cry so hard from night terrors and seeing this thing that he'd be able to turn blue and pass out. I slept in the room nearest the bathroom, and could without a doubt feel this extremely heavy, evil, negative energy. I didn't even want to go to the bathroom by myself either, but I had to put on a brave face for my nephew and take them to the bathroom and try to distract them. It was hard though, because I could feel it behind me when we were in the bathroom, and they'd tell me it was behind me. So kinda hard to ignore. So those bathroom trips were done as fast as humanly possible. My nephew Memphis is now 13 and does not remember the smiley guy, just what we've told him. He sees shadow people and hears whispering at night though. My sister Jenny has a daughter called Thule, who was 2 at the time. They lived in a haunted house together, and, ironically, they both felt a horrid, evil presence near the bathroom at the end of the hallway. She wouldn't go to the bathroom by herself, and wouldn't sleep by herself. Jenny is very religious and would pray every night, but to no avail. Her daughter would be playing and all of a sudden begin crying and say, "David, David," and point at nothing. We didn't actually know anyone called David, and this went on for quite a while. The crying about David took a toll on my sister mentally, and it all came to a head one night as they were sleeping when my sister woke up, seeing Tully's legs being lifted by an invisible force from the ankle, and her legs up in the air as if they were trying to pick her up by the feet and hang her upside down. My sister grabbed her and ran to the living room and prayed herself to sleep. She moved out shortly after, for obvious reasons, and later found out that a man had died in the home. The landlord conveniently left that information out. Now, and finally, my daughter. A few months ago, she got up from our bed to go to the bathroom. Nothing out of the ordinary, she always does this. The next thing I know, she comes flying back to our room and is crying, saying she's seen a man with a piece of his body missing. So once again, another one of the children in my family refuses to go to the bathroom alone at night. She also told me she was going to the bathroom and her hand was inside the shower. She came around the shower door and tried to grab her dress and pull her in from the toilet, as our toilet and shower are fairly close to one another. I don't know what this is, why all the kids are being tormented, but I will end this on a brighter note. My beloved Aunt Sherry on my mum's side got sick in 2016. She lived in Texas, and we lived in Oklahoma. We went down to visit her in March of 2016 when my daughter had turned 2. Since we lived in separate states, my Aunt Sherry had only seen my daughter once when she was a baby. During our visit, my aunt was so sick. She didn't want the kids to see her that way and have those be the last memory she had of her. So my daughter never saw her at the hospital. We stayed for about a week and things actually were looking up for my aunt. But unfortunately, not long after we got back to Oklahoma, we got the call that she had passed. Some time goes by and my daughter is laying with my mum looking at various pictures of family members that my mum has all over her wall. My daughter would then point to a picture and ask, "Who's that?" My mum would tell her and so on. Then my daughter pointed at my mum's open door, which led to an empty hallway, and said, "And that's Sherry, right?" and gave a shy smile and wave. I want to stress my daughter has no memories of Sherry being alive. There aren't even any pictures of her as an adult in our house, just of her and my mum as kids. My mum told me this, and I was very happy that my favourite aunt got to know my baby, even if we couldn't see her. One day as I was cleaning and my daughter was playing in her room, I asked as I was walking down the hallway, "Are you alright playing by yourself, honey?" And she said so matter-of-factly, "I'm not alone, I'm playing with Sherry." I honestly don't know if my daughter realizes Sherry is dead. She talks about how funny she is and how nice she is and how happy it makes her to see her. Just the other day she said, "I'm surprised Sherry didn't come see me today, I was feeling sad." And after a few days my mum knocked on the door and my daughter asked, "Who's that?" And I said that it was Grandma. "Oh, I thought it was Sherry." And then she carried on with her day. Most of the things my family have experienced have been horrible, so it's nice to know my amazing aunt is still looking out for my girl. It should be noted I personally have never seen ghosts, not as a child nor adult, and although I have had horrible sleep paralysis, I have never seen a ghost. My father, at 55, is strictly against the whole concept of ghosts. Not a spiritual bone in him, he's a man of science. My mother, however, is spiritual in nature and believes heavily in the supernatural, and always has. There was a story I was told by my grandmother, on my mother's side when I was young, that my father had been too scared to tell anyone. When my brother was newborn, my mother took off one evening for important business, leaving my father in charge of my brother for the evening until she returned. Halfway through the evening, my brother started crying over the monitor, and my father got up to help him calm down. Only he hears him calm down on the monitor, and quiet hushing from a woman's voice. She begins singing, and my father is put at ease for a moment. But then he remembers my mum isn't home. He rushed to the bedroom to find a woman with long, red hair similar to my mother's, shushing the baby over the edge of the cradle. She's singing softly, similar to how my mother does. He is frozen in the doorway, unmoving, unable to protect his child from the presence of the stranger in his own house. She looks at him, and her face is shrouded in darkness, as if it's purposefully hidden from his vision. The baby is silent and breathing softly, clearly unharmed and alive, just calm. My father said she simply took off out the window. He checked on the baby and he was fine. My brother, now 20, was fine. He was unharmed, breathing perfectly and sleeping. My mother got home and my father recounted what happened to her. Of course, my mother assumed an ancestor or something had come to visit her child in her absence, but it was never explained. I asked my father about it when I got older, just to make sure it wasn't one of those tales your grandma tells you when you're young. Sure enough, he tensed up and started telling me that we don't have to talk about that night. Eventually, he confirmed my suspicions. It did happen. He still just isn't exactly sure what happened. My dad's best friend grew up in India and was always a cautious boy. The reason for this is because his parents consulted a seer to know their fate. The boy was told that he was destined to die young, by cause of water, and this fate was bound to his soul. In an attempt to circumvent this, the boy's parents had his name changed and ordered him to stay away from water of any form. They thought this had ultimately changed his soul, as names are a pretty big deal in Hinduism. My dad and he had some big plans, then to leave India during college for greener pastures. They left for Germany and later the States together. However, midway through college, my dad's friend had to return to India for a family affair. My dad proceeded to America alone and had a family. He then had a business trip back to India and thought, maybe I should visit my old friend. He went back and searched for his friend. The town elder said he died 20 years ago at the age of 22. The cause of death? Drowning, trying to save a child caught in a flood. I think the child survived, so his sacrifice wasn't in vain. I can't explain how the seer saw this or even could know. The seer saw that the boy would die both young at 20 and by water, both of which were correct. I want to believe it was mere coincidence, but there are way more stories like this that my parents have. People say it's just a coincidence, but story after story I begin to wonder, could the old religions really have been onto something? When I was younger, I was a smoker. I mean a pretty heavy one. At the time, my grandmother also smoked. It was either a few days before or after Christmas, because I remember the tree was up. My cousin lived down the street a few houses down from me, coincidentally. This was a night when he was sleeping over. We would get to play on the PlayStation, which would be a great night, or so we thought. My grandparents were both sleeping at this point, since it was pretty late. We both smoked, and my grandma smoked Sonoma Regular 100. They were her favorite brand before she quit. Well, my cousin and I had a brilliant idea to go upstairs while she was still asleep to nab ourselves a good old-fashioned cancer stick from her pack. We went up the stairs, being as quiet as mice. When we reached the door, I pushed for it to open. Of course I had to, as it was my house. Wonderful. I pushed the door open, trying to keep quiet. As soon as the door swung open, a black figure jumped at us. It was like a real-life horror movie jump scare. We loved them in the films, but this, no. It made us both nearly crap ourselves. We bolted back down the stairs, ignoring the idea to stay quiet at this point, and once we were in another room, away from the stairs altogether, we were both pale. We both saw it. It wasn't one of those times where one of us would see something. Whatever it was, it showed itself to both of us. That'll teach us to keep smoking and try and take a cigarette again. We dubbed what we saw that night the Christmas Demon. My grandpa's death when I was 7 kind of jump-started whatever latent abilities I had. But this was 3 years later when I was 10. Whether animals or people, death has been a constant part in my life. I prefer to think that some of us are made to comfort the dying or the dead. I watched life leave the eyes of my grandpa, many pets and other humans. This particular day was normal for me. It was the weekend and it was nice out. I remember the phone ringing and my mother came out crying. She told me to get into the car, and we drove to my cousin's house. My family that is still living, my father Tom, mother Charlie, son TJ and daughter Mary. TJ was the oldest child, Mary was around 14, and the dad was a farmer. TJ would go with his dad and work the fields while Charlie and Mary hung out at home. That particular day, while the father and TJ were out farming, a stranger came to the house. He likely walked from the nearby interstate and murdered Charlie, then sexually assaulted Marie before murdering her too. TJ and his dad came home for lunch to find their bodies. The father is my mother's first cousin, and they were very close. My mother's first instinct was to go to the two and try and comfort them. I remember we had to park in the field because the entire property was swarmed with police and tape and emergency vehicles. I rolled my window down a bit, and my mouth instantly tasted like blood. All I could smell was blood. My mum told me it was okay. She just needed to see her cousin and talk about something and that we would go home. She told me that under no circumstances was I to leave the car, and not to talk to anyone, nor leave the car. She even locked the doors. I just remember looking at their lawn covered in lights and tape and cars, as I knew something really bad must have happened. The ambulance hadn't left yet. My mum was hugging her cousin while he sobbed. TJ was being questioned by a policeman, but he was just staring at the front door with a vacant look on his face. I knew this wasn't a good place to be. I kept tasting blood and wanted to leave. I was contemplating opening my door and just running. I don't know where, but somewhere that wasn't here. Then a very kind-looking policeman knocked on my window and asked where my mum was. I told him she was with her cousin, but I wanted to leave. He opened the door and crouched down and spoke with me. As we talked, I calmed down, and the taste of blood was gone. I could no longer see the front door. Any time I would ask about what was going on, the policeman in navy blue would effortlessly change the subject. Eventually, my mum came back to me and he said bye, and we shut the door. Mum then asked me why I had my door open when she specifically told me not to do so. I told her the policeman was talking to me. She said that there were no police people near the car. I thought about it. He opened a locked car door. He was in a navy blue uniform, and our local police wear brown. Days later, I learned that the murderer had killed Charlie in front of the front door. He shot her in the face. Her blood was on the door that the phantom policeman kept me from seeing. The murders were solved 20 years later. Unfortunately, that lowlife had been hitched up and down a small stretch of interstate, raping and killing women. By the time the DNA was analyzed, the sob was dead. Charlie and Mary didn't get justice, and I have no idea who or what that officer was. I know our farming community started getting better locks and more guns. I know there is a memorial bench for them at my school, and honestly, I hope that sad excuse for a human meat stick gets an eternity of suffering. This is a creepy story that happened when my friends and I were attempting to go on a paranormal adventure. We'd heard a few rumors about this place out in the middle of nowhere, an abandoned amusement park. They said the amusement park was haunted. Apparently, after it went bust, the owner took his own life by hanging himself from it. Rumors had it that they found his hanging body, lifeless, attached to the Ferris wheel. Apparently, the Ferris wheel will now move by itself at night, so naturally we wanted to see if this was true. One of my friends, who said he can sense the presence of spirits, really wanted to go, but two of my other friends required a bit more persuasion. We wanted to go at night, since it would be creepier that way. We had difficulty finding the location. It truly was in the middle of nowhere. It was in the mountains. I remember as we were driving up that we didn't pass any other cars on the roads. Finally, we found the abandoned amusement park at 2 a.m. I decided to park the car in a nearby hotel parking lot, since the roads to the amusement park were in rather bad shape. We could walk down that desolate road, and it would make the experience all the creepier. I had just parked the car, and everyone was taking their seatbelts off. Then we heard it. The unmistakable sound of knocking on the passenger side window. My friend, who said he could sense the presence of spirits, was sat in the passenger seat of my car. My car, which only moments ago was filled with laughter and excitement, fell silent. It was really eerie. None of us said a word. It was 2 a.m. We were in the middle of the mountains and we hadn't passed anyone on the drive up, and the hotel parking lot was empty. We all knew that it was impossible for a person to knock on the window and run off into the shadows without any of us spotting them. I looked out the window, and there was nothing but darkness all around us. It was awful. The tension was like one of those horror films where you know a jump scare is only seconds away. I was sweating, and didn't want to be the one to break the silence. My friend in the passenger seat just turned to me and said, "Let's get out of here." Just then, another knock came from the rear of the car. I glanced in the mirror and didn't see anything. I thought it could have been a stone hitting the car, but it sounded like a very deliberate knock. I was very, very cautious when I pulled away. I didn't want to get into an accident, and really felt that there was some kind of presence out there just watching us. I drove very carefully until we got to a nearby convenience store. Beneath the lights and in the safety of the convenience store, we all felt less frightened by what had happened, and we began to talk about it. My spiritual friend then said, "That was a warning. Something was out there telling us to turn back for sure. Do not leave the car. I think it's still with us." We drove further and further from those awful mountains, and I don't know how to explain it, but the air in the car shifted. We all felt better, like when you've given your presentation that you've been worried about for ages. It was now behind us. We got out of the car to inspect, and found several scratches on the passenger side door. From that day onwards, we promised to one another that we would not go ghost hunting again. Some things don't want to be hunted. Or maybe, some things won't be hunted. They'd rather hunt you. I can only imagine what would have happened if we had left that car and gone in search of the amusement park. This takes place at my childhood home, which sat on the edge of the woods. To separate the woods from the yard, my dad placed large boulders along the tree line. There was also a large mound of dirt from the foundation of the home in the woods. My youngest brother walks with a limp and was rather short and pudgy at the time. These details are important for later. I was about 12 when it started. My two brothers, Jerry and Joe, their friend Nate, and I were playing hide and seek around the house. The entire property was fair game, woods included, and my youngest brother Joe was it, and me and the other two boys hid behind the dirt mound. We waited there for about 15 minutes and started getting worried because he never came looking for us. I remember volunteering to find him and ran all around the property but never did find him. I went inside and he was playing a board game with some other friends. Okay, no big deal. I asked an adult how long he had been inside and they said about half hour. I ran back outside to tell the others. When I got to the hiding spot, they were laughing. They asked how I got away from Joe. I told them that he had been inside the entire time. They stopped laughing and looked at each other. I asked what was going on. Turns out they saw what they thought was Joe running behind me in the woods. As I reached the rocks, he disappeared. We saw him around a lot, but kind of ignored it, chalked it up to kids' imaginations, and played in the woods in groups. A few years later, we had another friend come over who'd never been to my house. We were all playing inside when he came into the room and asked why Joe was playing in the woods alone. We explained that Joe was at a friend's house and there was no way it was him. He insisted it was, and we asked him who told him about the man, and he had no idea what we were talking about. It still creeps me out. I'm 27 years old now. and it has been a long time since I have stayed overnight at my neighbor's house. Every time I stayed overnight there, I just had a bad feeling. One night when I was 11, it was the Patriots versus Carolina in the Super Bowl. My neighbors hosted a Super Bowl party, and after 10 of us kids were all hanging out and ended up spending the night there. We mostly watched the Puppy Bowl, 'cause we were kids and one kid really loved Brady and made us watch some of the game. The game came and went, and we were all trying to stay up as late as possible since the parents were passed out. Looking back, I realize now they all got super drunk. It must have been about 3 a.m. when all of us kids woke up to a loud crashing like glass breaking in the bathroom. We could clearly see the bathroom from where we were, and all the adults stayed upstairs and had their own bathroom. There was no reason for them to come downstairs and use this one. Additionally, we never saw anyone leave the bathroom in the hour that we sat there and watched the door. In the morning, obviously us kids got up super early because we're kids, we woke up the adults and told them what happened. They didn't believe us, and blamed it on us. It's hard for me to explain. In the bathroom, there is a sink immediately to your right. Above the sink is a mirror, and above the mirror is a shelf with a lip that prevents its contents from slipping off the shelf. When we walked in, one of the big, maybe 1-liter cologne bottles had seemingly been thrown off the shelf above the mirror. It was about 20 feet across the bathroom from that shelf to the tub. All the glass from the cologne bottle was shoved up against the side of the bathtub. No glass was below the shelf. It was as if the bottle had been thrown very hard against the side of the tub and stayed there. There was a window to the side in the bathroom, but it was small enough that a possum couldn't even fit through it. And this wasn't the last time. For example, by the way, this was a year after the events of the previous story. The family went to Panama, and I was asked to take care of their gerbils in the meantime. The first time I ever went over there, the house was empty. It's the first time that I'd ever been in the house, and it was alone. So, they gave me a key for the back. No issue. This was usually the way I would come in anyway, but it's hard to describe verbally. The second I stepped in this house, I got this chilling feeling like I shouldn't be there. To be clear, I had to enter there in order to go through their driveway to get to their garage and go onto their back-screened porch and then access the back door. And never once did I get a bad feeling before. This includes in the previous story. No bad feeling, and I had no idea about the history of the house. But when I walked in, the air felt heavy, and every nerve in my body told me to get out. I knew that I had to feed their gerbils, so I forced myself to get the food and water and to just leave. It was such a strong feeling of hate and anger. Apparently not the last owner, but the owner before that had hanged himself in the bathroom I spoke about before. Go figure. Maybe he just didn't like me. When I was 15, my best friend left the country for a year and left me a key to her house. That was fantastic news, as I would use the key to let myself into her house when me and my boyfriend were, in quotation marks, at the movies, and we would just hang out there and chill. Strange stuff would happen there. In the past, we heard water faucets open and whatnot, but being a big and old house in a third world country, we shrugged it off. Until one night. We were in what was my friend's bedroom when we heard someone at the door. Right off the bat, me and the boyfriend think it's my mum who followed us and that we're gonna get in trouble. We look out the window and notice there's no car or anything outside, and ask each other if by any chance one of us didn't lock it behind us. This is happening really fast and we're both starting to freak out. Could there be a burglar? Or worse, my mum on the other side. The door handle is being jiggled and it seemed like someone is trying to crank the door open, and my boyfriend and I agree to just open the door and push through and run outside non-stop. The door opened outwardly, so we thought if we pushed hard enough, we would mess up whoever was on the other side. Well, while the jiggling was happening, he unlocked the door and we both pushed the door open. It slammed. We ran and got into his car. While we were running down the stairs, I looked back and saw the door open and no one there. While we were freaking out and driving away, I bring this up and he says he also saw the door open and heard how it slammed against the wall. This was over 17 years ago. Whenever we tell this story, we call each other as proof that it happened because it was unexplainable. We obviously never went back. Funny thing is that a month or so later, my friend's dad came to the house for a few months and had to call a priest apparently because he kept hearing footsteps and the jiggling of the door. This takes place circa 2003, California, USA. I was around 16 years old, and we had just moved into a new apartment with my mother, younger brother, and older brother. My parents had recently separated, and things were still rocky for everyone considering my father had actually filed for a divorce without my mother knowing. She had moved to Florida with some family while she got on her feet. So my father handled the whole thing fraudulently and basically kept everything for himself and left my mother with nothing. So there was so much bad blood between them when she returned and became aware of everything he did. Both of my parents are from Mexico, and my mother has no experience with law and procedures, but also had no will to seek legal counsel and have the divorce reversed or to have my father prosecuted for fraud and forgery. Instead, she decided to do what most Hispanic women do, which is seek spiritual counsel from a witch to cast spells on my father, which at one point she sought my own personal approval, which I declined, and was angry at the fact that she would even ask me. I did not think she would actually pull a stunt like that, because prior to the whole separation, she was a devout Jehovah's Witness. But I soon learnt that she had transformed into a completely different person from the time she had left to Florida to the time that she had come back. Some time passed after she asked me about having my father cursed, and I completely forgot about it. That's when I began to have a series of sleep paralysis, which was the typical ones which can be dismissed as just that, until the next two incidents. One day during the summer, it was a hot Sunday, just really boring, so I decided to take a cat nap, and I dreamt that I was about to walk out the front door, and my mother was sleeping on the couch, and suddenly, a shadow figure appeared in between myself and my mother, and I could no longer move, but could see a tall shadow from the corner of my eye when I awoke. Frightened, I ran to the living room to see my mother rising up from the couch with a scared look on her face, and she told me she had a bad dream with the same exact scenario that I had had at that very moment. A few days later one night, I had a dream of a teenage boy about my age, just a randomer, appearing in my dream when I was with a group of friends, and he appeared out of thin air, and we all wondered who he was and where he'd come from. On the same night, I slipped into another dream, this time with the same boy. Only this time, he and I were walking through an empty home, and he was giving me a tour through the house, describing his family and siblings, when suddenly I awoke. My thoughts were that he was a departed soul, perhaps just passing through, and so I thought to myself maybe I should pray, and he wouldn't bother me anymore. And just before I began to pray, I was suddenly gripped by the neck and pinned down. I didn't see anything, but I heard a loud, shrieking whisper in my ear that said, "Shut up." Then I was let go. I shared this incident with a friend of the family, plus the sleep paralysis, and he responded by telling me that the word going around is that your mum is visiting a black magic practitioner to put a curse on your dad, and that perhaps something is attaching to us. I didn't really take it too seriously until the day I was getting my mother's car keys from her purse and found a business card from a witch. I later confronted her about it. I was so angry because of the sleep paralysis became so frequent, and she never responded and just looked away. Even one night when my girlfriend decided to spend the night, she was aware of my sleep paralysis and that it was normal. Now that I knew, When I would have those troubling nights, even before going to bed, I would get this rush and feel a slight vertigo, and she would stay awake so that she could wake me up when she saw me squirming. We slept in the living room, and my mother had an obsession with dolls, and my girlfriend didn't tell me right away, but later she admitted on that night she stayed over. She saw one of the doll's heads spin a full 360. Despite having a comfy flight from Manila to Sydney, I still felt tired. After passing through immigration, I immediately went to the arrival hall, loaded my Opal card, and then rode a train to my mate's flat to Burwood. It was raining when I arrived in Sydney, at only 18 degrees. The warm shower and the bed were the only two things I looked forward to. It was still raining when I woke up. The overcast weather made the day bleak and gloomy. Then I remembered the things I watched online a few days ago, and one of them were the ghost tours of Sydney. I asked my mate about it, and the next thing I knew, he already booked us an extreme ghost tour on the weekend, after my trip to Melbourne. Sydney was not a glamorous city back in the 19th century. Diseases such as smallpox, Spanish influenza, and bubonic plague were prevalent. To mitigate the spread of these infectious diseases, all ships entering Sydney's harbour must be checked by the doctor. Even if there was only one sick passenger aboard, everyone was required to stay at the quarantine station for 40 days. Those who were sick were brought to the hospital for treatment. And at least 1,600 people were brought here from 1830 to 1984. And a total of 570 people have perished there. Today, Q Station serves as a hotel, a conference centre, and part of a Sydney Harbour National Park. Our extreme ghost tour was scheduled to start at around 9 p.m. to beat the weekend traffic of North Sydney. We left Burwood at around 6 and drove all the way to Manly. We had our dinner there just before heading to Q Station, located east of Manly Beach. We arrived at 8:30, way too early for the tour, so we went straight to the front desk and toured around. Some of the original relics like tombstones, luggage, and clothes are still there. It felt eerie upon seeing those personal belongings, who once belonged to people who got quarantined here over 100 years ago. We met up with the group at 9:30. Our guide, Bob, told us we should not rationalize everything we see during the tour. Jason and I are both air traffic controllers, and in our work we rationalize everything. This time, we have to leave everything behind and open up our senses. We were given EMF sensors, the instrument that are used to detect anomalies in the surrounding electromagnetic field. The experts believe that ghosts manifest themselves as this form of energy. Our first stop was the chamber. There are 2 rooms, both that are not big, with a floor area of approximately 50 square meters. We were locked inside for at least 5 minutes just to observe everything. I didn't feel anything in the first room, except that it faintly smelt of hay. I didn't mind, because I thought it used to be a barn. But in the second room I felt something. The surrounding air felt heavy. I felt like an unknown force pressing my cheeks. It was quite difficult to breathe at some point. As we were out, Bob told us that it used to be a gas chamber, and that about 40 people were locked inside for sanitary reasons. Now it all made sense, why we felt heavy inside, and why I felt claustrophobia inside the room. Our second stop was the hospital. It was quite a long hike to the quarantine hospital, and during the early days it was harder to get to. You needed to climb the steep walkways. Basically, when you're on top, you're completely isolated. The hospital is located near the cliff overlooking Sydney Harbour. There are several buildings around, including the quarters of the nurses and doctors. Hospitals, no matter how modern their facilities are, can get creepy at night, but this one was way creepier than I thought. We first entered the doctor's quarter. It was dark but cold inside the room, and there were 3 bunk beds in it. As I sat and leaned on the lower bunk while listening to Bob's stories, I felt something was pinching my lower back. I shrieked and Bob caught my attention. I told Bob it was nothing. We went into the main hospital room. It was quite big and there were 6 beds. Feeling brave, I lied down on one of the beds and tried to make some connections. I don't know how, I just closed my eyes and felt nothing. And honestly, the bed felt so soft and comfortable. I transferred to an adjacent bed near the wall, and the moment I lied down, it felt weird. It felt like something was pushing me, but not in a forceful manner. The room is connected to another room that had a darker history. Bob told us to open the door, and asked if we felt something different. Everyone told him that it was colder in the room despite the doors and windows being tightly shut. Some of our EMF detectors went crazy. According to Bob, there are 4 resident ghosts inside this room. 2 children who love to play hide and seek, and a woman, as well as a malevolent spirit of an old man. There were stories circulating that one group who stayed overnight in the hospital decided to record themselves singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and caught something in the recording. They heard children giggling, and a woman saying, "Wait, wait," and an angry voice of a male shouting to get out. Jace had his EMF detector pointed near the cupboard and it went crazy. So what he did? He went and got his smartphone and started recording himself singing the same song. Actually, we were all at the center of the room and didn't hear him singing. After we went out, we played his recording, and believe it or not, he caught something. There weren't disembodied voices from the children or from the woman, but in the middle of his singing, someone was shouting in the background, "Your singing stinks!" The third stop was the gravedigger's house. It apparently was one of the most haunted parts of the complex. It's so haunted that Bob won't dig deeper into its bloody history. It used to be the house of the gravedigger and the doctor. Just a few steps from the house is the third-class cabin. During that time, there were reports of missing girls and children. Eyewitness reports claimed they saw some kids and girls entering the gravedigger's house. More so, the doctor was attached to the girls, especially the young ones. The house is a bungalow, which has 2 bedrooms with a small living room, dining room, and the kitchen and bathroom are both located at the back part of the house. Bob left us there for 10 minutes. The first room to the right used to be the bedroom of a paedophile doctor. As I slowly entered the room, the atmosphere drastically changed. It felt cold and sad at the same time. I don't know. I can't help but be sad in that room. I went out right away because I could no longer take the sadness. The second room was rather weird. I was about to enter there, but something felt wrong. It's like there's a force barring me from entering the room. Some of my group mates checked their EMF and it went crazy. I guess everyone was not welcome inside. The back portion where the kitchen and bathroom are located was the scariest part of the house. It was dark, but that part of the house was faintly illuminated by the moon outside. I stayed there for at least 3 minutes to just observe, and I suddenly felt goosebumps all over my body. As I neared the bathroom, it felt sinister, and I didn't go inside because my instincts told me not to. I managed to take photos inside the house, and my phone didn't catch anything paranormal, but all photos are creepy as hell. When everyone was outside, Bob confessed that the bathroom was the most haunted part of the house. Locals claimed that a girl was brutally murdered inside the bathroom. She got strangled by barbed wire. The fourth stop was the morgue. I never liked going to a morgue anyway, especially a dark and abandoned one. I was very nervous the moment we entered. To add to the scare factor, a mannequin lying at the center covered with a white cloth. I know it's staged, but it still scared the hell out of me. While Bob was talking about its history, it started getting cold, but weirdly only on my right side. No one was standing to my right, and there was nothing but a door leading to the laboratory. A cold breeze passed through. I wasn't paying attention to Bob's story because I felt someone standing near me. I whispered to Jace about it, and he scanned his EMF, and suddenly there was a spike of energy. He told me to calm down, but I was this close to breaking down. As minutes went by, I started to feel goosebumps on my right arm, and I can feel that someone is actually touching it. It was like a gentle caress, but definitely not human. I became uneasy after we went out the morgue, and Bob noticed it. He smiled and said, "There isn't a ghost like you, did he?" Really, Bob. The next stop was the shower block. It is the most haunted place in the whole of Q Station. During the time that those who are sick must take a shower of carbonic acid, not water. The acid kills fleas and ticks in seconds, and 2 days after your skin starts to peel off. It was dark and eerie as we entered the shower block. The stench was still there, and I felt lightheaded. The same feeling when you get out of a boat ride. Bob told us that there are shadows lurking around the dark corners, and for 15 minutes we were instructed to roam around and observe. He told us to go to the corners where we felt the most uncomfortable. I had goosebumps as we passed by the center aisle and turned right since we both felt uneasy on this side. As we were walking back to the center aisle, I felt someone watching us from behind, so instinctively we turned our heads slowly and saw a dark figure peering from the corner of the block. I am pretty much sure that my friend wasn't playing tricks on me. The figure was tall, about 7 feet tall, and it was darker than dark. And all of a sudden the figure came right after us. I don't know what happened next, but Jason and I were back at the main door of the block in a jiffy. Whatever that is, it scared the hell out of me. The tour lasted for 3 hours, and was already half midnight when we went back to the parking lot safe and sound. I honestly don't know what to feel after the tour. I was physically and mentally exhausted. Nonetheless, it was still a great experience. It finally validated that I am a bit sensitive to the paranormal. I do believe in ghosts, and don't easily get scared by them. But my experience at Q Station was overwhelming. A lot can happen in 3 hours. This happened when I was on a business trip to Los Angeles. I was staying about an hour's drive from the airport in a place called Anaheim, not too far from Disneyland. It was a pretty nice area, and it seemed safe at night too. There were 24-hour convenience stores and good-looking restaurants right by my motel. It was great. I had no problem with the location. I had a problem with the hotel I was staying in. The clerk on the front desk was very nice, but the second I checked into my room, literally the second I touched the keycard to the sensor on the door, something didn't sit right with me. I had a very uncomfortable feel about the room. The hotel room was fine, nice in fact for a business trip. It was just a normal single bed. There was nothing wrong with it, just I didn't like it. I didn't want to be there. I couldn't put my finger on why though. I didn't let it bother me at the time. I went downstairs to grab some dinner in a nearby restaurant. After that, I headed back to my room to go over my notes for the presentation that I would be making the next day. I guess that my initial apprehension to the room was brought on by my work nerves. I was immersed in my preparation when I heard a noise, a creak. I turned my head in the direction of a sound and watched as the bathroom door slowly opened by itself. It felt as if someone were opening it, as if for me to enter, inviting me in, like I was being beckoned. My spine froze. It scared me. I had never experienced anything like this before. My brain went into problem-solving mode. I guess that my senses were heightened because I was in a new place I wasn't used to. For instance, there might be a breeze in the bathroom or a window slightly open. I looked over to the window into the bedroom and saw it as it opened. I smiled and went over and closed it. Problem solved. I went into the bathroom to take a look, and of course there was no one in there, plus the window was shut tight. I went back into preparing for the presentation. After about 15 minutes, I heard a rattling sound, and then the bathroom door creaked open again. I didn't like it, but I thought it wasn't too much of an issue. I went over and shut it once more. When it happened the third time, I gave up on closing it. If it's open, it can't irritate me, right? Well, that's what I thought at the time. However, the open door started swinging slowly, and then it slammed shut. It opened again and slammed shut. Okay, I can't do this anymore, I thought. Time to call the front desk. I asked to switch rooms, but I was refused quite impolitely. I was told the hotel was fully booked. It certainly didn't seem fully booked. I couldn't do much else. I mean, if the front desk says there aren't any other rooms, then I guess there aren't any other rooms, right? I didn't know the area I was in well enough to be running out and searching for another hotel. Plus, my company booked me to this hotel. How would it look if I ran out on it? With these thoughts in mind, I knew I would have to reluctantly return to my presentation and other less frightening thoughts. I put the phone back on the receiver and started back to the desk when my legs felt trapped. I had no balance. I nearly flew headfirst into my suitcase. It felt as if someone had a hold of my legs, and if they tried to trip me. It was such a frightening feeling. Instinctively, I moved away from the bed. I didn't like the huge gap under it. Now I was starting to feel anxious and frightened, so I called a friend back home and told them what was going on, knowing they wouldn't laugh at me. And my friend gave me some advice. Do you have a Bible in your room? If you do, make friends with it tonight and keep it by your side. I laughed at this idea, but I fished around the bedside chest of drawers to see if there was a Bible, and to my surprise there was. I was flipping through it while chanting to my friend. I flicked through the pages and noticed something strange. In flashes, as the pages sped by, I saw a dark brownish-reddish stain. I felt sick, as I was certain it was blood. I closed the Bible and saw blood on the edges. You know the white bit around the sides of the pages where they meet? They were clearly blood splattered. I didn't know what happened in that room. I just knew I didn't want to be there any longer. I didn't care what my boss thought. I walked around until I found another hotel. Something was just very wrong there, and I'm thankful that I got away from it. When I was 18, I purchased my first home. It was a small rundown foreclosure home that I got for next to nothing, a perfect fixer-upper for my young son and I. My dad is a carpenter, and so he was able to do most of the updates for me before we moved in. Dad didn't tell me outright that anything supernatural ever happened to him, but on one occasion when I arrived to the house to help out, he asked me, "Was that you a little bit ago?" "No, I just got here," I replied, and he just shrugged. The other time he was under the house working on something and he kept hearing footsteps above him. Convinced it was my mum or I, he yelled a few times before assuming we couldn't hear him and gave up. I didn't chalk these up to paranormal experiences before, because I'd never had a paranormal experience and I wasn't even sure if I believed in them. Once my son and I moved into the house, I slowly started noticing odd occurrences. I constantly was thinking I heard the door to the breezeway open and close, and the sound of shuffling as if someone was arriving home. But of course, no one was ever there. The sound of footsteps upstairs was also very common. The first time my boyfriend came to the house and stayed the night, we were fast asleep when the stereo came on at full blast, scaring the hell out of us. The next morning we were sitting at the bar in the kitchen having breakfast, and we began discussing the previous night's events, and then my boyfriend proclaimed, "If there's really something in this house, I wish it would just show itself." As soon as he finished his sentence, we heard a loud crash, and we turned to look. A mini cooler was tumbling down the stairs with enough force that it left a dent in the wall at the bottom of the staircase. Another time, my boyfriend, our son, and myself were all sleeping in that living room. It was a very hot summer, and we didn't have central air conditioning at the time, so we had pulled the mattresses out on the living room floor where the window AC unit was. Around 3 a.m., we woke up to the sound of an alarm clock going off. We didn't use an alarm clock, so we jumped up to try and find the source of the noise so that it wouldn't wake our son. I'll never forget when I found it. I followed the noise to a plastic bag that was beside the couch that had some of my boyfriend's belongings in it, and pulled out an alarm clock. I was frantically hitting buttons trying to get it to stop before I decided to just unplug it. When I grabbed the cord, I realized it wasn't plugged into anything at all. I just held it, staring at it, and held it for my boyfriend to see before it stopped just as suddenly as it had started. The next day he inspected the clock, convinced it had batteries in it, but it didn't even have a battery compartment. This final story was the one that scared me the most. I was in the living room watching TV while my son slept upstairs. The baby monitor was beside me, and from my position, I could look straight up the stairs and see the door to my son's room. Well out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow dart across the upstairs hallway, and simultaneously there was a short burst of static interference on the baby monitor. The hairs on my arms stood straight up, and I stared up the stairs at my son's door. The hallway was illuminated by a nightlight, and my son's door was white, so I could see it fairly well. It looked like a head was peeking out from across the room to the hallway from my son's door, but I thought surely it was my imagination. Until after about a minute it stepped out. The thing that terrifies me the most was that it didn't glide across the floor like you see in the movies. Its movements were so human-like and distinct, and three-dimensional, that if it hadn't have been a black, stark silhouette, I would have thought it were an intruder. It stepped out the doorway and took a few steps across the hall to my son's door, then turned its head like it wanted to check if I was watching before it stuck its head in, and shoulders through my son's door as if to have a peek, to see what was in there. When it did, I mustered all the courage I could and just yelled out, "No!" And it pulled its head out and quickly dematerialized in such a strange way. It was like it shrunk into itself until there was nothing left. I have goosebumps just sharing this. I bounded up the stairs, grabbed my son, and left immediately. I stayed the night at my mum's house for about a week after that. Eventually I sold that house, and I've never had a chance to ask the owners if they've ever had any strange experiences there themselves. I would have been about a year old. I was asleep in the nursery, and my parents were awake in bed talking before going to sleep, when all of a sudden they heard an adult voice loudly go, "Shh," from the nursery. They both bolted up out of bed and rushed into the nursery to find me awake, but thankfully alone. They never told anyone because who would believe it? There was also an incident with my ma around that time. My dad had gotten up at around 5 a.m. to go to work, and she was in bed, deciding whether to get up or sleep a bit more. She decided to get up, and as she stepped out of bed, someone reached out from under the bed and grabbed her foot hard. She immediately pulled herself back up on the bed and was frozen there in fear for some time, waiting for someone to speak or make the bed move, or start crawling out from under. Eventually, she flew out the door, grabbed me, and then a weapon. But when she worked up the courage to go back to their room and look, of course there was no one there. Again, my parents never told anyone, because it sounds crazy. I tend not to believe in ghosts or spirits, but the stories really freaked me out. Around the time I was 8, I lived in a trailer house at the end of the road. So everything was on one floor. Living room, kitchen, my parents' room and my bedroom in the other half of the house. But there was an extra bedroom built to the side of the trailer, which was my older sister's room. So when we first moved in, I got some creepy vibes from the house, especially from my room. So that is when I wanted to sleep in my sister's room. Mind you, me and my sister are 7 years apart, and we did not get along until I was 15. So obviously she wasn't really happy about that, but I didn't care. I was always afraid of the dark and being alone. At first I didn't experience anything paranormal. I did things that I've never done before, like sleepwalk. My sister would tell me she would just see me get up, stand there for a while, sit, maybe lay back down and even pee the bed. I would often wake up on the floor, Months later, I would start experiencing paranormal occurrences. The first time I was sound asleep, but for some reason I opened my eyes and saw a boy standing there. He had a grey and blue aura around him, like the ghosts do in cartoons. So since I was a scaredy cat, I ran to my parents' room and cried. After that, I decided to move out of my sister's room and into the room that was supposed to be mine since we moved in. This room was the only room in the house I didn't like to be in alone, after the things that happened, and it was always the coldest room. So my room had a whole wall of a sliding door closet, and it was wood. I would often hear tapping in the night from the closet, and I would tell my sister, but she would just tell me it was because the wood was growing. I wasn't the brightest when I was little, so I brushed it off and the tapping kept happening every other night. But one night I heard a whisper clear as day telling me to turn around. I started crying from fear and wanted to yell for my mum and dad, but I couldn't. Then the last night I slept there, I had sleep paralysis. It was the first and last time I had it. I saw a tall, pure black figure just standing at my door staring at me. And since when you have sleep paralysis you can't move or speak at all, I tried yelling for my mum, and just a gasp would leave my mouth. I don't exactly remember how I came out of it, but I ended up sleeping in the living room for the next few months. More experiences have happened, like my mum would work night shifts, so I would often sleep with my dad, and I would always wake up in the middle of the night because I would feel a big ball of pressure on me and wouldn't be able to speak. But my dad did wake up from my gasps. Another time I was in my parents' room just watching TV while my sister was in hers. Earlier that day, my mum had bought me some cookies and put them in a beautiful glass bowl. My parents left me and my sister, so we decided to put the bowl on the fridge where I couldn't reach it to grab more. I was in my parents' house, which is next to the kitchen, and the bowl just flew off the fridge. My sister came out of her room and began yelling at me. She accused me of trying to grab some or jumping off the bed. I was so chubby, she would have heard me jumping. That's when she was yelling at me, and you had to wind it to play a song that happened to be in the living room next to the TV. But it was at this exact moment that it began to play while both of us were arguing. My sister and I both freaked out and ran to her room and locked ourselves in there until our parents returned. Other little things still happened afterwards, like some of my things disappearing. I also got a puppy that stayed with me all the time called Marley. He would often bark at the room, but I decided that I felt safe with him and me, and he slept in my room till we moved out. He is my best friend till this day, and I'm 21 now. Also, in case you're wondering why I never mentioned telling my parents or sister of my experiences. My mum being the only devoted Christian at the time, my dad being a skeptic, and my sister who was an emo kid and a teenager, I never had anyone to talk about my experiences with until recently, when I told my sister and she was shocked on why I told her. Well, like I said, we never got along until I was 15, and I sure was an annoying little sister. I also told my parents too, but who knows if they actually believe me or think it was just my childhood imagination. But I never watched scary movies until we moved, and now they're my favorite. I never got to know the new owners, and I've wondered if they've ever had experiences like that. We moved to 3 different houses since then, and I never experienced anything remotely paranormal again in my more recent ones. I've lived in this last one with my 3 dogs, including Marley. One last thing. I rarely have nightmares, but when I do, it's always set in that house and in my old room. One of them was me walking down the road at night and looking at my bedroom window, and the closet door would open, and there would be a decapitated head of a man, just there, staring right at me. My house was originally a tiny 2-bedroom bungalow, and my neighborhood started as a vacation and retirement community. It still is a retirement community. Our joking slogan is, newlywed or newly dead, since people often move here to raise their young families. In fact, raising a family is exactly why my parents bought a home here. They came to visit my mum's college friend and fell in love with the cozy, flourishing yet quiet neighborhood. As it so happened, our house was for sale at the time and they started looking at it, and it was within their price range. Before they even had their first daughter, me, my mum saw the other neighborhood kids loved the big old chestnut tree in front of the neighbor's boulevard. So when the person living there wanted to cut the tree down, she tipped off City Hall, who told the neighbor they could not cut down the tree as it was on city land. I know this might seem like a lot of detail, but I think it's important to set the scene. Until we renovated, everything was perfectly normal. Not a hint of anything paranormal whatsoever. And then, when we did the first round of renovation, still nothing. In fact, there's really only one specific instance, right after the second round. We added a second level that consisted of a sitting room, 2 bedrooms for my sister and I, and a washroom. Now this part is important. The top of the stairs and the washroom door line up nearly perfectly, so you can see really clearly from the other point. The washroom had a big bathtub that had a removable shower head. My sister was using the shower head to wash her hair, and so was leaning over the tub. As she was rinsing, she looked between her side and arm, out the door. On the landing of the stairs, she saw what appeared to be a person in a trench coat. Startled and panicked, she stood up and then spun around to see nothing. The landing was empty. Being young, she ran to our mum's room, and years later, when we asked her about it, she'd completely forgotten. Years later, I was working at a pet food store for a fundraiser, and we bought in a medium whose strength was animal communication. I figured I'd have my dog read, even if it was just for fun. Besides, it went to a good cause. My dog is a pretty anxious dog overall, but she'd been doing one thing in particular that kind of weirded us out. She'd stare up at the landing on the stairs, cower and back away like she was afraid of something, so I asked the medium about that. She told me my dog was seeing someone on the stairs, something that appeared to be wearing a long garment like a cloak or trench coat. Honestly though, I thought it's probably just a previous owner or occupant in the house coming to see why it's changed so much. I don't think they mean any harm, my dog is just an anxious mess, but she's my anxious mess, so I burned some dragon's blood incense and politely explained to whoever was there this is our house now, although they were free to stick around if they wanted, just so long as they didn't scare my dog anymore. I think it worked because my new dog now loves to sleep on the landing at night. There was an inn in my hometown. It was built in the 80s when Japan's economy was skyrocketing. Leisure resorts and the tourism industry all thrived back then. After that period in our history, the inn suffered a decline in popularity, possibly due to increased tourism abroad and the fact that inns like this went out of style. Eventually, the lot and the inn were bought by a development company, and the inn finally and permanently closed its doors. Someone had heard that the plot was to be used to create a relaxation resort. The odd thing was that the company that bought the inn and the land went bust. History repeated itself, I guess. Before development could begin, their bubble burst. No company or anyone got involved with the inn and the plot of land, and therefore lay there derelict, and only served a purpose, a gloomy monument to its former glory. The inn wasn't exactly in the public eye. Back in the day, there were signposts pointing guests towards it from the highway. Now, the darkness, weeds, and dense overgrowth had claimed the inn. If you weren't looking for it, you'd never find it. That in itself is a double-edged sword, I suppose. You wouldn't find a business sign for the inn nowadays. All you'll see is an ominous dark outline if you perchance glanced out your passenger side window as you drove past it. It was around this time when the rumors about the inn began to spread. There was no doubt the rumors were born from the fact that it had become a frightening-looking building, and not through any substantial evidence. In short, people said the place was haunted. One rumor started that the owner took his life when his business went under, and that if you went to visit, you may see his spirit at night. Another rumor said there was a murder that happened in the building. But of course, as we knew the real history of the inn, these were nothing but baseless rumors. I know that the owner sold the inn at the best possible chance before the bubble bursts, and that he was living very comfortably these days. There was no suicide or murder either. The locals usually know the stories which are behind abandoned buildings, but people who just see a derelict building presume they have the right to come up with their own truths. However, some of the locals have said that they have seen a pale light emanating from the inn, and that they have seen shadows pass by the window. That's pretty creepy, right? The owner of that mysterious shadow was likely an urban explorer, and that spooky glow of pale light, his flashlight. Because of rumors like this place has become supposedly haunted. It was actually featured in a magazine and I couldn't believe it. The article interviewed an individual who had witnessed paranormal activity there. The interviewee was adamant that he saw an apparition in the inn. After this publicity, the inn gained a lot of popularity. Young people would turn up at all hours of the night, making noise and flashing their flashlights everywhere. It annoyed us locals so much that there were requests to demolish the building, to stop the nuisance that it caused. Then as time went by, the day of the demolition came, and the creepy abandoned inn was no more. It was said that there would be a shopping centre erected in its place. I don't know why, but I was kind of sad to see it go. I guess that seeing it daily for 10 years or so does that. A few days after the demolition work began, I saw police cars parked outside the abandoned inn. I wondered if there'd been a car accident or something. Later that night I was watching the local news and found out why the police cars were gathered there. You see, during the demolition, they found the skeletonized remains of a body. Initial reports concluded that the person had passed away between 6 to 10 years ago. Well, that coincides perfectly with when all the rumors began. I guess sometimes there is a truth in rumors. Perhaps they did see someone, and something paranormal was happening in that inn. But I'll never know for sure. It's certainly creepy though. When I was between the ages of 11 and 12, I was staying at my father's house, which my little brother and I did every other weekend as our parents were separated. I remember experiencing my first and only spout of sleep paralysis the weekend before. I wasn't able to move, complete fear consuming every part of my soul. I did the toe curls and finger wiggles to get myself out, but never once opened my eyes because I was afraid, and had never experienced seeing anything during that time. However, this weekend, that I had the previous experience completely out of my mind, I figured it was just a nightmare, you know? So it was a normal night and we went to bed around 10:30. The same routine, and the same kind of setting with nothing out of the ordinary. I wake up like normal but early, at around 6 a.m. on this Saturday. The sun rose and I remember the room completely lit with the sunshine, but I knew it was early, and I was on the bottom bunk of a bunk bed with my little brother on top. I woke up and was wide awake. I felt completely rested and amazing. Something us adults don't truly experience anymore, sadly. It was one of those wake-ups where you stretch and smile, like you're in a complete state of satisfaction. I do so and then relax, with a good feeling flowing through me. We had a large box TV in our bedroom that was about 6 feet away from me on a TV stand, and in the middle of the TV was an inch or two above my eye level when laying on the bed. In the middle of my blissful relaxed state, I turned my head casually and looked at the shut-off TV that sat before me. I could almost see the entire room. Like I said, the TV was big, but the first thing that caught my eye was the thing that almost gave me a heart attack. What I saw was something very tall, naked, leaning its head over the bars of the bunk bed ladder. It was directly above me, and only inches away from the top of my head. It was crouched over with its head just above mine and looking down at me. It did, and still does to this day, remind me of the aliens from the movie The Signs. I mostly died right then and there. My heart has never dropped so hard into an adrenaline beat. I'm not even sure if I was breathing. I was a very smart kid and did the only thing I thought was best at the time, with the pounding of my chest increasing at a rate faster than anything considered alive. I played like I didn't see it, slowly rolled over and casually grabbed my blanket to cover my head. I figured if I didn't know it was there, it couldn't get me. I lay there with my heart beating out of my chest for probably an hour and a half until I grew the courage, ripped the blankets off, and flipped over to meet it face to face. But it was gone. I've never forgotten it, never tried to forget it, never tried to disprove it. The only thing I've ever done is accept it. What I saw was real, in my room, and I probably stared at it in shock for over 20 seconds, not in disbelief, but in complete and traumatizing fear. I went from ecstasy and complete satisfaction to the most fearful I've ever been in my entire life. If you want to know what I think, it was that the thing fed off fear. It allowed me to feel beyond great in order for me to produce the thickest amount of solid fear anyone can make, and that's exactly what it got. A few months ago, I heard a strange howling outside. It was the middle of the night. I thought I was hearing the TV upstairs until my grandfather texted me asking what was going on outside. So I grabbed my shotgun and flashlight and went out. It's hard to explain the layout of my property, but when I walked through the door, I walked up the balcony, down the stairs, and across the old volleyball court. It was silent until I got to the edge of where it turns into a steep hill that goes straight down to the beach. That's when the howling started again. I wasn't that scared at first because I thought it might have been a sea lion. They can make weird sounds that almost sound human. So I started walking down the trail that leads from the court to the ocean. I was more or less excited because there has never been any sea lions in the cove where I live, but they are known to be around the area. I got to like the first quarter of the trail, which opens up to a flat spot where we have a few burn barrels and a bone pile, various things to trip over. I was about 60 yards from the house when I heard something sprinting up the trail. I got super spooked at that point and raised my gun up. The sprinting stopped, and I could hear noises moving away from me. This was the longest walk back to the house of my life. I literally inched back to my house, still facing the beach the entire time. When I got back, it started back up again, but it stopped soon after. That was night 1. Almost a week went by and the howling began again around the same time, and I had about the same response: shotgun and flashlight outside. I flashed the light around trying to see anything, but it was too dark, and I tried pulling out my phone to take a video, but the howling stopped, so I went back in. The next night I was out with my dog, and he began growling at the trail, and he slowly started walking towards whatever he was looking at. I heard walking down the trail, then something thumping, almost like someone was trying to get to me and my dog to follow me down the beach. I don't use that trail often, if ever. But when I went to the trail the following morning to look, something had definitely been walking through it. So I borrowed some trail cams from my buddy and set them up on the trail in my house to see if I could catch something. And the next day the cams were gone. The day after that the howling started again. It's like whoever was doing it was trying to get me to the beach. A week goes by, nothing. Then in the middle of the night I hear what I thought was the wind knocking things around, and the next morning nothing is out of place except muddy smudges on both door window and doorknob and the window next to my bedroom. The next night is a snowstorm, and I hadn't seen or heard anything, almost like whoever they are doesn't want to leave behind footprints. Am I overreacting? Could it have been a bear? I hope so. I'm not much a believer in the supernatural, but I need an explanation. It's really disturbing to be with someone one day, and the next day, they're dead. When in this case, the lines fall along the same terms with me and my father. To begin, my dad had a long-term childhood friend that he grew up with throughout all his young, juvenile years. Their bond was very unbreakable to the fact that an argument was very unlikely between the both of them, but over the course of years, as both matured and began to have children, it was very, very common that I would look at my father's friend as an uncle. So to me, my father's friend was Uncle Paxton. I could roughly recollect a lot about him, but not a full description of what he used to look like since he passed when I was around 5. The best memory I can remember of him was the day right before he died. It was just a standard day compared to others when Uncle Paxton would be around hanging at the house, but from my father's recollection, he had made a money-betted game that was supposed to take place 2 days after he passed. The game they had betted on was Madden 09, but due to Uncle Paxton's death, the game couldn't be carried on. And as for my father, well, let's just say he didn't take it so easily the first few weeks after he was gone. But very soon my father began to accept the fact that his long-term friend or brother was gone. It's a tough pill to swallow, but what else may life have held for us individuals? The least we can do at times like this is grieve and then move on. Well, that wasn't the case for my father. The paranormal sightings for my dad regarding Uncle Paxton didn't begin until months after his passing. My dad normally kept things like this to himself, never revealing anything to a single soul. But the sightings for him started so seldom to more and more frequently as time progressed. My father would recall sightings at various functions, to other sightings like the gas station or in his dreams, the store, and he even saw him through the rearview mirror in the back seat of his car. This being the reason for how my father nearly veered into another lane, almost causing a wreckage, but he caught composure, and just as Uncle Paxton's apparition vanished in an instant. He said that every time he saw him it was in silence. He was never trying to relay a message to him through his hands or anything else. He was just silent with a blank expression. There were countless times when my father would be around me, and times I would stare up at him, and he would be in shock. I'd often pull on his pant leg to bug him about my necessities, or other such things a kid may have asked or wanted, but even I would be in a sort of blow seeing my father so shocked and tranced off into a dead space. It didn't make sense to me until now, since my father has told me this story. The sightings for him have gotten so out of control to where my dad has begun to lose sleep. This carried on for about a year until my dad decided to seek help. He didn't get assistance from anyone he knew, since he still wanted to keep it from people. But I forgot what type of person he got help from. My father never really considered stuff like this, being so petrified he wanted to try anything to cease what he was undergoing at the moment. So somehow, he managed to get in contact with this woman, who claimed to help those with experiences dealing with the paranormal. And the following week or so, he seeks help from the woman and tells her his story about him and his friend. One of the initial things she asks is there some type of event or occurrence that was supposed to take place before his passing? It took my father a moment to think, and then it clicked. The last thing they were supposed to do was play Madden together one last time, but Uncle Paxton died before he could even get the chance. The woman then replied with, "Sometimes those who are dead cannot proceed into the afterworld because there is something on this side holding them back." She then proceeded to tell my father that if he wanted the sightings to end, then he would have to finish and seek the task that's keeping Uncle Paxton held in my father's life. The last tip she left with was wait until everyone in the house was gone, turn off all the lights, shut the curtains, light a candle, and proceed to turn on the console. And the following day after my dad returned home, he did just that after dropping me off at school that morning. He said he followed every step the woman had recounted to him before turning on the console, and I kid you not, as soon as he did so, the door that we had to the attic connecting to the dining room burst open, and right after that my dad recalled feeling a gust of wind blowing past him. As the Madden game started, my dad said he began playing with who he believed to be his deceased friend. He had both remotes connected, and although the other remote never moved out of its place where he'd left it, the screen showed otherwise. During this experience, my father recalls being more dejected than spooked, but said that at the end he felt a huge wave of relief hit him, and after that the sightings of his friends stopped. My dad never told me who won that game. He said the least he could do was keep it a secret. Also, I was one of the only people my dad told this story to, and the only reason he had started to tell me this story is because of me asking why he used to be so revered at one point in time when I was younger. After asking, he began to tell me why. I'm 24, and can assure you that his story chilled me to the core for a while. I woke up to my dog jumping off the foot of my bed when he was sleeping and lightly barking. The way he alerts the house is if he hears people in the lawn or otherwise suspects intruders. He's a good guard dog. I'm still a little out of it when this happened, so the ghostly sound sort of passes me for a bit while I try to calm the dog down. But then I start to hear it. A very rhythmic, loud inhale right beside my bedroom window. No exhales, just inhales, over and over and over. I'm frozen in place in my bed, and I do a reality check since I'm no stranger to sleep paralysis. That's how strange this experience was. My mind immediately went to, I'm not even awake, this isn't real. But alas, I was, and I am writing this, and it's only been 10 minutes. The sounds went on for maybe 2 minutes from the moment I woke up. No idea how long they were going for before that, but probably not long since my dog alerted them so strongly when he initially noticed them. Then they just stopped. My dog laid down on the foot of my bed, seemingly telling me that the danger was over. But God, it was so incredibly close to my window. If it was some sort of machinery in the house, which I want to believe, and it is the only logical reasoning I can come up with at the moment, the next issue becoming identifying what type of machinery sounds so similar to a person inhaling rhythmically, not to mention the location of where it happened. Let me clarify, my bedroom is on the 2nd floor, so we can all collectively rule out the possibility of there being a human person standing outside my window. When I was a kid, I saw something. I was laying in my bed, the room door in front of me wide open, and to the left I could see the room where the front door was. There was an antique cabinet that my dad had that illuminated a white glow. I started to freak out for no reason, and started sweating. I for some reason knew crap was about to happen, and I was about to witness something. About 5 minutes later, hot in sweat, I saw it. There was a door in the back of the room with the front door that was storage. A black, outlined humanoid figure walks out, mildly static looking. It takes a few steps towards the front door, then stops, does a military-like turn and faces me. At this point, I'm losing it. It walked into my room and stops beside my bed, does one more military turn facing me, and at that point I figure, what have I got to lose? I noped the hell out and ran through the thing, ran upstairs to my parents' bedroom, and knocked furiously at the door, waiting for them to let me in. My eyes focused on the stairs, making sure it wasn't to follow me. Nothing. I slept with my parents the next few nights. It's one of the scariest things that happened to me as a child. A short time after the shadow people encounter, I began to settle down, and my thoughts were no longer fearful. I also believe this was during the time I put up a dream catcher that my mother got me. Let's just say the dream catcher really did the job for years, maybe because I truly believed in it, and my mind worked in its favor. One day I woke up in the morning to Mum yelling down the stairs for me to get up. It was a school day. I had a shower, came back to my room and sat on my bed, sluggishly slipping on my school uniform. And this is when it gets creepy. As I was pulling up my socks, I noticed a flash outside my door, more towards the room with the front door. Not the bright camera type flash, but more like an invisible person walking past super fast my front door. For those of you who have played Halo, it looks like someone walking around with the invisibility cloak, but real fast past my door. You can still see them, but not entirely. I saw this from the corner of my eye and began to freak out. I went upstairs to eat breakfast and remember how scared I was, and sat there staring down at the table as I ate my cereal. My mother asked what was up, and I looked up at her with a straight face and said something along the lines of, "I saw a flash by the door downstairs." Something walked past my door. I said this calmly and with a straight face, and now that I look back, it must have looked like I was the classic creepy kid. My mum just said, it's all in your head, and I went back to eating, and she went to the laundry room behind the kitchen. And that's when it happened again. I was eating when I saw another flash of an invisible person walk past the kitchen door. This time I was paralyzed, as in I stopped chewing and was now staring straight down at the table. Whatever these things were, they were playing with me. My mum walks in, stops, sees my reaction, and again I calmly say, it just did it again. Over there, pointing at the kitchen threshold. I tell my mum that something's playing with me and that I'm not imagining things. What really relieved me but freaked me out at the same time was her reply. I know. It relieved me because she believed me, but she freaked me out because she basically confirmed their existence. About 10 seconds later, we both heard someone walking down the stairs. They're wooden, so the creaks can be heard. It was very slow. I remember thinking to myself it sounded as if their cover's blown and they're trying to sneak out. My mum and I both looked at each other, and once we heard it, it stopped. She looked around the corner down the stairs and there was nothing. Dad had already left for work. My Filipino cousins, as I'm half Filipino, and I, were gathered around the TV. Some of them on the floor, one on the back couch and me on the couch by the sliding door. We were all watching either a game show or something overly bubbly. At the time it was getting late for us, about 10 p.m. or so. And here's where the realest stuff goes down. I'm sitting on the couch with my legs up and one knee up. The remote is dangling on the backrest, edge to the right, and I hear it drop behind me. So little me, being the ninja I am, slides over to the top of the couch on my back, like a bridge stretched for your back, with my face pressed up against the glass. I grab the remote, and from the corner of my eye I see a little girl with black hair. She had a white dress on and was looking down, so I couldn't see her face. She was in a crawling position, backing up like she'd been caught trying to escape. She was backing up towards the middle of the room, towards the Christmas tree. I was still upside down at this point when I managed to look over at her and she vanished. I scuttled right back up and then jumped. All my cousins looked at me in confusion, and then I explained to them what I saw, and they basically started shaking their fingers and pointing at me, as if they knew that I must have done something to see something. They were smiling though, as if it were a completely normal thing to experience. To this day, I still think that they were just messing with me with the whole you got in trouble with the supernatural, but I know what I saw. I've always been scared crapless whenever I was in the Philippines, especially that house. In the area we live in, Betis, this house was like a mansion. It was opposite some basketball courts, in case anyone knows Betis. Anyway, if anyone ever goes to the Philippines, be sure to ask the locals for some supernatural stories. I'd imagine people there have had their share, as all my Filipino relatives have, including our maids. One maid ran away once because of an encounter. She came back, and I've met her before, but she just hates talking about it.
When I was a child, I awoke to see the outline of a figure standing with their back to my bed. I thought it was my mother putting clothes away in my brother's dresser. I looked over to my brother, who was sound asleep. I called out to who I thought was my mum. As I peeked over the blanket, the figure looked over their shoulder when I spoke. They turned towards the door and walked out of the room. I sat up quickly because there was sound, and I realized that the door was closed. It had never been opened. The figure walked through the closed door. They say I was dreaming, but I know that I was awake the entire time. My father confirmed years later that he believed in the ghost of my grandfather and how he haunted our house. It's not in a bad way. My nana sold the house to my mother and father when they got married. My father told me that he had been working in his woodshop in the basement, running a chore shop, when he heard someone call out his name. He removed his eye and ear protector and saw no one there. He returned to work and it happened again a second time. He thought it may have been a neighbor yelling outside. He listened for a moment and then returned to his work. When he started up the saw for the third time, he said he felt a hand touch his shoulder and heard his name clear as day. He said when he swings around, the bulb in the pull chain at the swing of the base of the stairs went out and was swinging like it had been pulled. He proceeded to check the entire house, gripping a ball-peen hammer. No one was home. No neighbors were outside either. And he was completely alone.
I want to tell you about the creepiest thing that ever happened to me. It's actually a series of a few incidents that have happened over the course of several years. When I was young, I had awoken abruptly in the middle of the night. I'd heard my dad call me from downstairs. It was really dark, and I was wondering what he had wanted. I hopped out of bed and flew down the stairs as fast as my little feet would carry me. I had reached the landing and looked out into the darkness and whispered, "Yeah, Dad?" There was no response from behind the darkness. I listened. Then a familiar sound penetrated the blackness of the room. It was my dad's earth-shattering snores. My mum must have kicked him out of the bed for being loud. Confused, I looked towards the kitchen, and for some reason felt compelled to go there. I headed down the hallway into the kitchen to find a small fire starting in the oven. I ran into the living room and shook my dad awake. He put out the fire and took me back to bed. This was the first incident. The second happened several years later. I was on the computer playing RuneScape and chatting with a few friends when I heard my dad call me from upstairs. "Be there in a minute," I called out loud. I headed upstairs into our living room, only to find no one there. Bewildered, I headed over to the stairs, figuring he was still in his bedroom. I called up the stairs but got no reply. I started to take a few steps until a familiar rumble was heard in the distance. He was asleep. He didn't call me. I was a little freaked out at this point and had remembered what happened years later. I stood in silence for a few moments until I heard a knock at the door. I froze. It was 11:30 p.m. Why would anyone be knocking on doors this late? I might have answered it too, if it were not for what had just creeped me out. I went over to the window and looked out and saw two larger middle-aged men. I went back to my computer to tell my creepy tale to my RuneScape friends. A few days later, I had discovered that several houses in my neighborhood had been robbed, and people had been hurt. Turns out they received a knock on the door late at night, only to have the men push their way into the house and rob them. This was incident number 2. Another few years later, I was heading home from a friend's house late at night. It was getting very dark, and it was a bit foggy as it was fall. There are 2 ways to walk home from my friend's house. One significantly longer than the other. Normally, I would take the longer way when it was dark, as I felt it safer. But I was really tired and wanted to get home, so I figured why not? Let's take the shortcut. I began walking down the shortcut, which was basically a path that cut through the long way. It was very foggy, and you could only see so far, when all of a sudden, almost as if within the soundtrack itself, I heard someone, a male's voice, shout my name so loud, I threw down my headphones and they hit the ground. I nervously took a long look around for a moment, but no one was there. I swore I'd heard it though. Male voices screaming my name. It sounded so distressed. I looked down the path now, too afraid to continue down it. A lone figure appeared through the fog, almost exactly like this was out of some sort of horror movie. You best believe I turned tail and ran until I got home. This was incident number 3. The final incident happened only a few years ago. I made a friend who enjoyed all things paranormal, and she was always researching and looking into situations that involved anything of the like. She had convinced me to let her try to do some sort of contact with the spirit world to see if I had anything following me. As I had mentioned, I had thought it in the past. I had experienced some paranormal activities, but I had never mentioned to her these stories. She took the pendant I wore around my neck and used it as a pendulum and swung over words and letters, and apparently it was supposed to spell out things or say words like a big Ouija board. She began asking a few general questions. I wasn't really paying attention, although it did interest me a little. I didn't truly believe it at all. Until she spelled out 3 words: fire, door, and path. I freaked out a little, and I think my friend knew by the look on my face. I then went to tell her exactly what I had experienced with the male who sounded like my dad calling my name. We both got very freaked out and decided it would be best to leave the rest of our questions unanswered. Since that day, I haven't experienced anything else that I can recall, but I still do think back to those times and try to figure them out, but still have been unable to. When I was around 5 to 6, my parents got a pair of twin-size mattresses second-hand from a family that didn't want to take them with them when they moved away. I got one and my younger brother got one. We were excited to have them since they were our first big kid beds compared to our previous beds. That first night I remember waking up because something shook my bed, like I heard it squeak and shake. I awoke and screamed for my mum. She told me it was just a dream and to go back to sleep. This happened again the next few nights. Then my mum and dad got fed up with it and told me to stop waking them up. My mum prayed over my bed for it to stop moving, and that night I slept fine and my mattress didn't move again for several more nights. Then one night I awoke to what felt like something moving inside the mattress under me, like a finger running up and down my spine. I remember telling my mum it felt like a rat or cockroach crawling up and down my back. She must have thought I was crazy, because she ignored my complaints that it kept waking me up. It was around this time I began to see figures in the hall, and instead of waking them I just snuck into their bed. This was a pattern that continued until I was too big to sneak into their bed, and dealt with some insomnia and sleep paralysis for several years. 7 years later my parents finally bought me a new mattress, and I remembered the first night sleeping on it was like heaven. It didn't move or anything. I told my mum that I was so happy because the mattress didn't move, and she was shocked because she thought I had just grown out of it.
Let me take you back to a rainy night in March of 2022. I work as the Dean of Criminology and Security Supervisor in one old college in Baguio City, Philippines. While waiting, I decided to scan our classroom on the ground floor of the gymnasium to let time pass as I waited for the rain to stop so that I could leave and go home. It was around 10 p.m. and all employees had gone. All that remained was I and 2 security guards posted in the main gate, the other at the guard post near the college's ground. I went to one of our rooms designated as a crime laboratory, serving as a classroom and a literal laboratory for forensic activities, and decided to do a little cleaning and equipment inspection as our criminology students rarely clean their space when they leave the room. As I was cleaning, I heard a loud bang, as if there was an explosion or gunshot in the rear section of the room where the cubicles for forensics were located. Following the loud bang was a weird yet familiar smell. I felt my heart rate spike up. The smell was burned human flesh. I'm sure of it, since I served in morgues when I was a criminology intern in 2015, tending to various people post-mortem. I was certain of my assessment. It was at that moment with haste that I switched off the lights, locked the doors of the crime laboratory, and briskly walked to my office. I told myself, the hell with this, I'm not going to check out what it is. I remembered the stories shared with me by tenured employees. They go as follows. As the building was being constructed, where the college is now built, construction workers would often come across bayonets, helmet, ammunition, landmines, and even human remains. You see, our college stood on land garrisoned by Japanese soldiers in World War II, just like most of the sites and structures in our city. Who knows what atrocities could have been committed on this land, and how many lives were lost as a result, and how many restless souls still wander the area. It's best not to find out.
It was around 10:30 p.m. Zay, my son, would not go to sleep as he was restless and fighting his usual sleep schedule. Kids, what are you gonna do? When his mum was in the kitchen making dinner when he decided to spontaneously awake, I decided to focus on getting him back to sleep. I picked him up out of his crib and thought I saw a human-shaped shadow in the corner of my room. But because I was moving so fast to get him and to make a bottle, I didn't notice too much. After trying to sit down on the couch and feed him his bottle on it, I realized that it wasn't going to work. So I let my wife know that I was going to go to his bedroom to try and feed him and get him to sleep. So I went in, sat down in my rocking chair and tried to feed him with the door to the kitchen open. After realizing that it wasn't going to work with the door open, I stood up, walked over to the door and shut it. The room became pitch black. Now I'm not afraid of the dark, I should make this clear. So I shut the door and sat back down, in the rocking chair, and started to rock back and forth, hoping to get Zay to sleep. He kept on moving from side to side trying to get comfortable. And he was. I looked up to try and give him a bit more space and for his head to lay on my chest. As I picked my head up, I looked towards the corner of the room when I saw a human-like figure from the floor standing ominously in the corner. At that moment I didn't feel scared, more protective than anything. I wanted to ask why it was there, but out of respect and tiredness and not wanting to wake up my son, I just stared at it, and it stared back at me. At least 15 minutes went by just rocking in the chair, staring at this entity, and it never moved once. Enter my cat Missy. It pushed open the door, and as soon as the light hit it, I watched it evaporate into nothingness. It was gone, and the cat pushing the door woke Zane up. So I shooed her out, closed the door, all the while holding him. I sat back down, looked at the corner, as my son put his head onto my chest and went back to sleep. The thing then formed again, out of the floor, and we continued the stare-off for another 5 minutes, until my cat opened the door again, and once again, it vanished. This time I decided to leave the room with Zay in my arms and his bottle in my right hand. That was the last time I saw it, but I think it still lingers around. Both my wife and I feel it in his room every time we go in there day or night, whoever or whatever it is. At least it doesn't seem malicious. I had 2 uncles who weren't related to each other. They'd each married one of my dad's sisters. They were good friends though, because their wives were close, so they would take joint vacations and co-host parties and things. One of them died and his widow bought him a plot in a certain cemetery. 2 years later, the other one died, and his widow ended up buying the plot in the same cemetery, figuring she could bury her husband next to her brother-in-law. That way they wouldn't be alone. So I'm at funeral number 2, standing in a cemetery on a snowy day, about to bury my second uncle in as many years. Suddenly, I hear a sizzle. I blink, and instead of a cemetery, I'm staring at the backyard of my second uncle's beach house. My first uncle is at the barbecue grill, and he turns to me and says, "Do you want any lamb?" Then my second uncle walks up with paper plates ready to serve. I blink and I'm back in the cemetery. I don't think that ghosts roam the earth, but I'm pretty sure I had a vision of where they both went, together on a vacation, waiting for more family to arrive. I will preface this by saying that I am on the fence about my belief in ghosts. I think there are too many witnesses, too many videos, and too much evidence for there to be nothing going on. However, I have my doubts about the authenticity of orbs and electronic voice phenomena, especially involving those who set out to prove that ghosts exist, more so if those people are making a television program on the topic. I have no evidence, just my word against the world. I'm not here to prove anything. All I can say is what happened to me, and I can't explain it. Let me take you back about 20 years ago. It was August, and I was on break from college in Chicago. I was visiting back home in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and had brought a friend from college with me, Mike. During the day, we had gone with another friend called Aaron to the old sanatorium grounds on the outskirts of the town of Howell. Originally, the Michigan State Sanatorium was used to treat patients with tuberculosis. After antibiotics and vaccines led to a huge drop in cases, the place became the Hillcrest Center for Developmental Disabilities. The buildings had been torn down in the 80s, however the area was still creepy, like finding fire hydrants randomly in the woods, and steeped in urban legends, such as there being inaccessible tunnels that had long ago filled with snowmelt and rainwater. We never found the tunnels, but what we did find was something that looked like it might have been an entrance to a building at one point. It had two extremely overgrown evergreen shrubs alongside a couple of waist-high decorative walls. The walls composed of stacks of hand-sized stones bonded with concrete. They were crumbling from age and neglect. We thought it was a cool and creepy find, so much so that Aaron pried a stone from the wall as a souvenir. Later we stopped by the Ann Arbor Denny's to hang out with the campers, a name given to those who routinely hang out at the 24-hour restaurant to smoke, drink coffee, and socialize. Aaron proudly displayed his stone on our table, which caught the attention of our waiter, a friend of ours called Sebastian. He was one of those people who considered himself either a psychic or an empath, something along the lines of the sixth sense. I always just go along with those type of claims. I can neither prove nor disprove someone is psychic. I figure as long as no one's getting hurt, what's the harm in letting them believe? Anyway, Sebastian's smile dropped upon seeing the stone and he inquired about it. After telling him how we obtained it, Sebastian insisted Aaron put it away as it had a bad energy. The idea of the stone having negative attachments eventually led to plan for Aaron, Mike and I to go back to the sanatorium grounds that night, except this time we would be joined by a fourth person, a Denny's camper called Steve. Sometime after midnight, probably 2 in the morning, the 4 of us were driving down Sanatorium Road. Due to the brightness of the full moon, we easily found the old entrance. It was at that point when things got weird. Aaron began pacing around in a rage, occasionally kicking and cussing. The impression we got was that he was possessed by a spirit. Whether or not this was true is impossible to verify. Aaron had a history of embellishment to make his stories more dramatic or exciting, and also had ADHD and years' worth of anger issues. Him behaving erratically wasn't exactly uncommon. As usual, I just went along with it. Soon after, Steve started acting differently. His attitude went from upbeat to subdued, and he started talking in a somber tone. He proceeded to sit on the ground, his back against part of the stone wall. To find out what was going on, Mike and I tried talking to him. While he acknowledged our presence, he acted like we were strangers to him, but not in any alarmed or reprehensive way. It was like if you tried to start up a conversation with a stranger sitting next to you on the bus, polite but withdrawn, cautious perhaps. Now, I didn't know Steve very well. I didn't know if he was prone to embellishment or lying to get attention, so I tried asking him if he knew anything about tuberculosis. This was a test to see if there was a spirit possessing him. My logic being that Steve probably didn't know the history of the place, but perhaps a patient who died there may have a response to a question about their ailment. He replied that I should check on my friend, referring to Aaron, who was by then growling while stomping at the side of one of the walls with such force we thought he was attempting to knock it down. Then, Mike clutched at his chest. He fell to his knees, saying it felt like someone was squeezing his heart. This, to me, was perplexing. We knew Mike pretty well. He was an Eagle Scout and a devout Catholic. I never knew him to lie nor embellish. I could see Aaron and possibly Steve playing up with the idea that they were possessed, maybe a prank, or perhaps playing up the suggestive nature of wanting to have a supernatural experience so badly you believe you're actually having one. The same way if a person is told that they are in a haunted house, the person is more inclined to think they feel a presence. Mike, however, never struck me as that type. He seemed to have some empathic ability to at least sense those around him. I know this because I like to play a prank where I walk very quietly and stand an inch or two behind someone without them knowing, so that when the person turns around, they bump into me and are startled. However, I could never get this to work on Mike. Every time I tried, he would say hi to me, letting me know he could sense me behind him. Maybe he could sense me, maybe he saw me in the reflection of his glasses or something like that. I don't know. As usual, I just went along with it. Before long, things started to wind down. Mike was feeling better, Aaron and Steve were returning to normal, yet I hadn't felt or seen anything. So I stepped away from the entrance area into an adjacent open field, still unsure if anything I witnessed was real. I was curious if I could sense something, so I went into a sort of meditative state, just opening myself up to my sensations. After a few minutes, Aaron, Steve, and Mike came my way to return to the Jeep so we could get going. I joined them as we walked, and I felt this heavy, dark feeling come over me. At some point, Aaron asked me a question, and when I replied, he said he didn't sound like me. Not a different voice, but more like my tone, like when Vincent D'Onofrio's character snapped in Full Metal Jacket. The way he talked was how I spoke, and the feeling of sanity lost in anger was how I felt. Mike would later tell me that at that moment he couldn't sense me anymore, which really alarmed him. As we drove out of the sanatorium grounds, my mood got darker and darker. There was just this building rage inside of me, and once we got back to the main road, Aaron stopped at a gas station. As he went inside the store, I climbed out of the Jeep and proceeded to repeatedly punch the passenger seat. I'm talking a red-faced, teeth-clenched, growling, frenzied assault. After a while, I ran out of steam, and with it, the anger was gone, and felt slightly drained after, but otherwise fine. Aaron later told me that he was worried that if I went too far from the sanatorium grounds while I was still experiencing whatever this was, that it might bond with me forever. I don't know if that's true or not. I can't speak for what happened for my friends. All I can say with certainty is what happened to me. Was it possession by a ghost? Did something lingering, negative attach itself to me? I don't know. What I do know is nothing happened to justify such anger. Nobody said anything, nothing bad happened to me. Everything was fine, and then it wasn't. And that is something I can't explain. On a side note, in the 2 decades since this happened, the old sanatorium property has been turned into a neighborhood of luxury housing. I haven't had any confirmed reports of paranormal activity from residents of that neighborhood, but I wouldn't want to live there, that's for certain.
Where I come from, the paranormal entity we're aware of is called a jinn. They are believed to be a bit like humans, but invisible and made of smoke. My grandma swears one day when she was out in the field at night, she saw a jinn. They started throwing stones at her and spooked her horse, and she heard barefoot noises chasing after her with no one behind her for at least a mile. I personally didn't believe any of it, but she still gets scared while recounting the story. I myself have had a few strange things happen to me as well, but they're probably just mere coincidences. I'll let you be the judge, though. The first thing happened when I was a child, staying in my aforementioned grandmother's house for the summer. It's in a village, no life or sounds around after 10 p.m, and I was sleeping with my father in the bed, when suddenly I awoke. I swear to God I saw a dark figure praying on top of us. Praying like Muslims do 5 times a day, you know. I looked at it for about 3 seconds or so, and it was just a very dark shadow. I immediately closed my eyes. I didn't want to be a coward who wakes up his dad for probably nothing. I hear no sounds, nothing that makes any sound at all. And I didn't feel strange or feel like something was wrong. Just scared the living crap out of me. After calming myself down, I went to sleep again. There was an old fan spinning in the room because it was so hot. In the morning, I thought it was probably the shadow of it due to the very bright moonlight coming from the window. But God, what a scare it was. The second time, I'm in my grandmother's house again. They told me to grab something from upstairs. It's daytime, and as I'm slowly climbing the stairs, suddenly someone sprints past me and heads for the upstairs, scaring me crapless while doing so. I look to see that it's my aunt and don't say a word. She probably has some business to do right away. She reaches upstairs way before me and vanishes from my line of sight. I get there too, grab what they need from me, and head back down. Now, this only took about 5 seconds, and I was just near the stairs. I head down to see my aunt sitting down, having coffee with my mum. It was impossible. I don't know if I imagined the whole someone running past me, but I swear that I saw my aunt go upstairs and I didn't hear her come back down because I was right on the staircase. I still don't know what that was. It's probably worth mentioning that my aunt was having very intense sleep paralysis and everybody was telling her it was a jinn messing with her. They said someone put a spell on her for the jinn to target her. The woman she spoke to told her there is a water well near our grandma's house and that the jinn lives there. She wrote her something in Arabic and never had night paralysis or anything spooky happen to her again. In that same house, my father and I were watching a found footage exorcism movie, and in one of the most intense scenes, the door to our right slowly opened, making that typical horror movie ghost door opening sound. My father looks at me, and I look at him. We both look at the dark room, staring at us, and he says, "What the hell?" We close the door and continue the movie, and it didn't happen again. Must have been the wind, right? In my own house, I'm watching a YouTube video late at night, and I hear 3 knocks on the house's front door. I heard them slow and strong 3 times. So, around here we have superstitions for everything, and my mind goes, oh my God, it is 3 times. They say the dead knock 3 times at the door when they come for a visit, and it was 3 a.m. I was crapping myself, shaking, and I yell for my mum. She doesn't hear me, but my father wakes up and I told him what I heard. He goes down to the front door to check it. It's probably just the pipe, son. There was nothing after all. The jinn stuff is scary, especially when you grow up hearing so much gossip about them all the time. I personally don't believe in them, but still, some things that I experienced, I just can't find a logical solution that I'm satisfied with.
I've had several paranormal experiences through my childhood and adulthood that were and still are unexplainable. I never thought my childhood home itself was bad. My parents bought the house and moved in to the acreage when I was 1 to 2 years old. The original owners built the house, but we were the first to live in it, if that makes sense. I always thought the land was bad. We lived less than 1/4 of a mile from my dad's pasture, and the pasture had wagon trails through it. Though I don't have proof, we always thought they were Oregon Trail imprints. The energy was off, but it was beautiful and the scenery drew you in. As I said before, I had more than one experience at that particular house. The first story that comes to mind is when I was a teenager between the ages of 13 and 14. I was home alone. The house was a single story with an unfinished basement. The basement had 2 bedrooms with carpet and drywall. The remainder of the basement was cement flooring and cement blocks with exposed beams and wires. We had a common area with a TV, foosball table, and computer desk, but the majority of the basement was used for storage. I was home alone, for one of the first times. I almost always had an older sister home, so I wasn't usually alone, but this time I really was. My mum and dad were gone for the day, about an hour and a half away, and my 16 to 17-year-old sister had gone to see her boyfriend. I was enjoying my time alone. I was blaring my rock music as loud as it could go, trying to sing along and hit the high notes in Atreyu's lead, sails, and paper anchors. I'm nailing it, and not really paying attention to anything that's going on around me, when all of a sudden I hear my sister's voice say, "Hey," the way she always did. I turned down my music and yelled up the stairs, "What?" expecting her to come down and tell me what she needed me for. But she never came. Confused, I walked upstairs and looked around, calling her, and I froze when I saw that the front door remained locked, and her car wasn't in the driveway. The second story I'll share tonight is from the summer of 2009. I was 14. I remember the time of year because my aunt passed away from lung cancer that July. She had breast cancer that was in remission for 10 years. When we noticed it the second time, it was already in her brain. My aunt was childless, but treated all of us like we were her own. She was a hugely positive part of my childhood. She was my safe place. I've never handled death in the way that you might. I find relief in death and cry out of happiness for the person so they are no longer in pain, and for their loved ones left behind. I didn't cry for myself. I had to tell myself to cry when I simply felt relief so that I wouldn't stand against my weeping sisters. No matter how I felt, I was missing a very important woman in my life now. I would go through phases of moving my furniture around the room to unusual places. At one point my bed was centered in the room. I don't have a headboard, and on the wall opposite of the bedroom door was a closet. I centered my vanity. This vanity was vintage and heavy. The mirror was textured from age around the edges and would reflect the majority of the room. I went to bed on my bed, in the center of the room, and woke up that next morning just as the sun was beginning to rise. My window faced the west, but the sun hadn't filled the room just yet, only about halfway. I woke up, with my back to the closet, and bedroom door and my face towards the mirror. I rubbed my eyes and stretched before looking in the mirror. In the reflection stood my auntie in a white robe. Her hair looked beautiful. She wore wigs and bandanas towards the end of her life, a chocolate brown color cut in a long bob. She was bright and beautiful, and I was immediately very terrified. It was my aunt, but I knew she was gone. I covered my face and body with my quilt and waited. I felt pressure on my mattress and felt someone get on the bed along with me. I felt knees on each side of me straddling me. I was petrified and didn't trust that it was really her. She never said anything to me, but I felt her there for the moment, and I fell asleep hiding under the covers and woke up again later that morning. I believe it was my aunt, visiting me to let me know that she was okay, and I felt terrible that she scared me. I haven't seen her since, but I'm fully aware of her presence at times. She and Grandma have always loved that I keep cats. I went hunting with my cousin once, up on a mountain where we live. We were bow hunting, and he tells me to go over the hill and sit. I go and sit between some downed trees, sit there about 20 to 30 minutes, and I close my eyes and listen a little better. I hear a growl about a foot away from my face. Sounds big too. I open my eyes and nothing. Nowhere. So I sit for a few more minutes and close my eyes again. I had my bow sitting across my leg, and something jerks the bow, like a couple of inches. Definitely not to get my attention. I was like, screw this and get up. As I'm going back up the hill, I look, and there are old clothes everywhere. I don't know if someone had died up there or what, but it's the mountains east of Kentucky. Stuff happens, and there's room to dump bodies without people knowing. This next story happened to my kid. We lived in public housing at the time. Later found out they had moved a cemetery to build the apartments. First time when he was around 4, he came running from the hallway between the kitchen and living room and hides behind the recliner I'm in. You could look straight into the kitchen dining room from where I was. He peeks around and says there's a man staring at me. I think, what? And go look out the door and window, but there's nothing. I tell him there's no one out there. He's still hiding and he says, he's still there. I tell him there isn't. I get goosebumps and ask what he's doing. Just look at me, I say. That's when it all started. He told us there was a woman who lived in his closet, who had scraggly hair and was mean. He never slept in there. He would just randomly say, "Do you see the girl? She's wearing a flower dress." He spoke of multiple ghosts the time we lived there. But another time I was going to our bedroom on the 2nd floor. My wife worked 3rd shift and was asleep. I go up and get her before work, and when I got to the top of the steps, she sits and says, "Who's that woman?" I tell her our son is behind me and that's it. "No, there's a woman behind you. And I thought she was riding on your back, she was so close." There's a whole load more encounters that I can't remember off the top of my head. But as you can imagine, living on top of an ex-graveyard is creepy.
I worked in a cafe that was retrofitted into a very old building downtown. One day I was in the walk-in fridge in the horrible, unfinished basement. I had the door open and was gathering up whatever I needed when I saw out of the corner of my eye a white shape move past the door. My immediate reaction was, "Oh, that's just Chris the waiter in his white shirt, no big deal." It was only several hours later that I realized, 1, Chris had never come downstairs, as I asked. 2, Chris was wearing a blue shirt that day, and since we had been working together for half the shift, I knew that. 3, if he had walked past that door in that direction, he'd have walked straight into a wall. What strikes me about this situation is that it was a totally illogical conclusion to arrive at, and I should have been freaked out by the anomalies, but instead calmly leapt to a faulty explanation. I think the whatever it was messed with my head, radiating "I'm something harmless and familiar" vibes. I had a friend who died of AIDS in the 90s, before we had so much knowledge about the disease, or the excellent pharmaceuticals of today. He was such a wonderful man, joyful, loving, and as he got sicker, his friends and I set up a roster of folks to bring food and visit him. He died in a period where I hadn't seen him for 2 weeks and I felt terribly guilty. Besides grieving him, I was so sad I hadn't said goodbye. Guilty I hadn't signed up for a roster spot in those last 2 weeks, and ashamed that one of the reasons I hadn't signed up was my horror at what the disease had done to him. About a week later, I woke up with a feeling of joy and forgiveness with a touch of goodbye. I'm sure it was Brent. I'm not an especially joyful person and I don't generally give up on guilt. It would just be like Brent, to go on nurturing his friends even after death. That's what I have, and what I can't explain after 60 years of skepticism. I'm a Catholic, and for a period of time in my mid-20s, I visited some monasteries as I was open to the possibility of being a monk or friar. During this time, I spent around a week in a Benedictine monastery in the western United States. One night during my stay, I joined the monks for Compline. Compline is the prayers that they say right before going to bed. It's sometimes just called night prayers, and is one part of it where you ask for God to protect you during the night. We all know that the night is when we're probably most vulnerable, so it's fitting to do so. So after the nightly routine, I went down to the monastery basement because I needed to either iron some clothes or do last-minute laundry. I can't remember which. When I got down there, the laundry room light was off, as well as the light to the hallway that led to it. I walked straight into the laundry room, and when I did, I slipped on the floor and almost fell but caught myself. When I inspected the room with the lights on, I could see there was water all over the floor and the hallway to the laundry room was flooded a bit. The floor in the laundry room was very hard, so if you slipped and hit your head, you'd probably have a bad injury or worse. I'm alone in there, trying to dry up the floor as best I can with what I could find. I remember just being in there thinking I wish one of the monks would come down here so that I could let them know and we could at least put some warning signs up so no one slips. Shortly after that, one of the elder monks came down the hallway and he looked confused, like he was looking for someone that wasn't there. I took advantage of him being there and told him that there had been a flooding issue down here and it needed attention. This is where it became strange. He told me he had just gotten a crackly phone call to the landline in his room that someone, claiming to be their maintenance guy, told him there was a leak and he needed to come down to check it out. He asked me if I'd seen anyone in the area of the basement before I got there, and I told him no. The lights were off and no one was there. The source of the water ended up clogging up a water drain outside the basement, and it was raining that night, so the water was flooding in. Anyway, the monk called the maintenance guy right while we were speaking there and asked if he'd just called him about the leak. The maintenance guy said no. At this point, the monk and I were both kind of baffled. I mean, who the heck called him if it wasn't the maintenance guy? Especially since the man who called him said he was the maintenance guy and with the same name. At this point, I had a moment where I felt a little eerie but also comforted. After all, we had just prayed for protection during the night. I don't know who exactly spoke to the monk to warn him, but I had a feeling it was an angel, to make sure no one would be hurt. This experience left me with a sense that we're truly not alone in the universe, even if we might feel that way sometimes.
About 15 years ago, in the small town of Darlington, Indiana, my mother had a couple of paranormal experiences. I was around 3 or 4 at the time, so I can't speak of my experience. My mother has only had paranormal experiences ever when she lived here. When we first moved, there was a dog that we had called Diamond. She went outside to tie the dog to the only tree in our yard when she met our neighbor, who she described as a crazy old lady. The old lady told her that if she were to tie her dog to the tree, it would go mad. It happened to the last 2 neighbors, and my mum just dismissed her as crazy. My mum would see our dog at night playing around and barking. She said that ghost dogs would come from our forest behind our house and play with him. Slowly over time, our dog became more and more aggressive. He'd attack anyone who would come in range except me. He'd let me play with him though, and I could go by him and pet him, and I'd even put rocks in his mouth and he wouldn't care. But after a while he became so aggressive we couldn't even get close to feeding him, so my mum had to put him down. A few days later, my mum said she experienced the scariest thing of her life. She said that one night she was in bed without my dad, since he was at the hospital during cancer treatments. I was in my bedroom sleeping at the time, and she said that she woke up to the sound of a water sprinkler outside our trailer. She saw our cat staring at the end of the bed at the window where the sound was coming from. She got up and looked outside to see flames being spat from just the air. She looked for a minute as it slowly approached the trailer, and she ran back to bed and hid under the covers and prayed that it would go away. The next morning there were no signs of any burn marks, and the entity never returned. We finally moved from the trailer about 3 years later when my dad passed away in the trailer of melanoma. What's your guys' idea on what this could have been? One day I wasn't feeling that well at work, so I asked my bosses and they told me I could leave early. I was getting a really bad migraine. On my way home I turned on my high beams. The back road I was on has no streetlights, and it was around midnight. My headlights lit up all the tall trees on the road, and I could see perfect colors with my lights. Out of nowhere, this figure walks out of the side of the road, solid black, not transparent and no details, just literally black, around 6 foot tall, and had what I can only describe as flashlight eyes. He just stared at me. I couldn't see any other details. even with high beams on, just his eyes. No nose, mouth, ears, even an outline. He was just a solid black silhouette. And then he just turned and ran into the forest at an unnatural speed. I thought I was seeing things, and I went home to my fiancé shaking. I was too scared to get out the car. He tried calming me down and making me feel better, and he said maybe I was just tired and seeing things. Maybe it was nighttime hypnosis. A few days later we had friends over. We're sitting there scrolling through apps looking for a good movie to watch, and I look at my fiancé and friend, and they both turn and look out the back door window. They jump up screaming. My friend ran to me with tears streaming down her cheeks, and I was confused. My fiancé ran into the other room, grabbed a gun and ran out the back door. A few moments later he came back in shaking. I asked him what was wrong. I was severely confused at this point because we have a 6-foot-tall wooden fence, and I was trying to tell them animals can't get into our backyard without making a lot of noise if they tried. They both at the same time told me, flashlight eyes. I thought they were pranking me, and my friend wouldn't sleep in any of our guest rooms because of it being near the window, and we all ended up sleeping in the living room together. I haven't seen flashlight eyes since. What could he possibly be? I've looked up ghosts, cryptids, demons, everything. It looks like it's the rake, but from as far as I can tell, that's supposed to be white. It was a bit like the rake but solid black with no detail or anything. Like a child's drawing if they filled in a character with a black shape. And then its shining eyes. I didn't believe in the paranormal until this incident. My first sighting was 3 miles from my house. I don't know how this thing found me or kept up with me. I was going 50 miles an hour over hills and turns, scared out my mind.
Let me tell you a story about how a ghost harassed me when I was a child. When I was 10, we moved to a new house in the country. A cozy, homey place, very comfortable. When I think of home, I think of it, and I miss it often. I like to imagine I'll go back to it someday and buy it. That being said, it was the oddest damn house. From what I understand, it had started life in a nearby town, and then was physically moved about 6 miles out. Someone then tacked on about 25% more house, I think the family who lived there before us, and I'm told it was some creative DIY. Anyway, they tacked on the new master bedroom and bath and extended the living room, then an enclosed screened-in back porch. My parents got the new master, my sister and I got the original master, behind was this newer porch add-on, and I have no idea why they added that porch because it just made our room dark all of the time. The moon had to be large enough and set or rise at just the right time for us to get light in there at night. A whole year passes and we're very happy. We liked the house, but sometimes, about 30 minutes to an hour after my sister and I turned out the lights in our room, something would start bumping in the attic. Big thumps. Like someone with 2 peg legs started going round in circles. My sister and I called the thump bumps. We made up whole stories about them. Honestly, I think if my unexplained experiences had remained this simple, I would have chalked it up to rats, which we definitely had. The thing is, I've since dealt with both rats, wild and tame, and while it's not impossible for them to make such sounds, why constant circles? Why did it sound so heavy? And if it were jumping, you'd hear the answering slap of its tail. Also, rats have their very own lives to run. They're not automated. Why take enormous bodily leaps and circles in a steady, rhythmic pattern for 2 to 3 hours at a time, several days a week? But whatever, we weren't afraid. It was odd, not bad. Early summer rolls in. I've turned 11. And I woke up suddenly one night when I heard someone doing dishes, running water, dishes clinking against one another, and normally I would have seen some light on in the corridor wall, but it was black, which meant someone was doing some dishes in the dark. I glanced at my clock, 2 a.m.
I was thirsty, so I may as well check out what's going on. Just as I turned the corner from the living room, the sound cut off like someone had hit stop on a cassette player. There was no squeak of the faucet handle being twisted, or the stream slowing to a trickle of the dishes being set down or anything. The sound stopped, mid-splash, mid-clink, and I was left in complete silence. Nervous but now committed, I slinked into the kitchen. The sink was bone dry, and everything clean. Why shouldn't it have been, when we had finished the dishes the night before? I still have a clear memory of the moonlight glinting off the faucet. I didn't know what to think, but nothing seemed awry. I drank my water and went to bed. I don't know how long passed, only that it was summer and a Sunday. That morning I had been playing with my toy dinosaurs, of which I had 5. I lined them up on my bed very neatly before heading off to church. I was the last one out the house because my dinosaurs were important business. Well, when we had finally returned, my parents unlocked the door and in we tromped. My brother first, who turned into his room ahead of me, and then me second. I stopped right in the doorway and I felt real fear hit me for the first time. My dinosaurs were no longer lined up on my bed, but scattered across it, like they had been played with. One of them was lying underneath the bed. One was lying halfway under my pillow, and one was lying at the foot of the bed. Worst of all, my velociraptor had been jammed together with the iguanodon, like they were locked in battle. This one bothers me a lot, because it's scary no matter how I interpret it. If it wasn't spirit shenanigans, then who did it? Dad was unimaginative, Mum was busy, and although my sisters and brothers would be excellent suspects, the last one out the house was me, and there had been no time for anyone to come in and mess around with my dinosaurs. I still asked my sister if she'd done it, and she said no. The most logical thing to think is that a stranger broke into the house, only played with my dinosaurs after seeing how cool and awesome they were lined up, decided to leave after regretting it, and then did so, leaving, which frankly is a terrible thought. In fact, there is nothing scarier than a human being, and I prefer ghosts to them any day, but I guess I'm getting off topic now. So I'm seriously unnerved connecting the dots. I don't know what they suggest. I put my dinosaurs away and told no one. Well, not long after, I wake up in the middle of the night. It's an unbelievably dark room, but this is normal. I was very cozy, deliciously rested, safe and snug. One problem was my left arm was sticking up out of the covers at an awkward angle, like I was trying to slap the ceiling. It was actually uncomfortable, but I was so relaxed that I didn't want to even move or put down my arm. Suddenly, a warm adult hand presses down against mine. It drags it down against my palm. The ball of their hand catches on the ball of mine. The skin is rough, almost moist, and I can feel all the fingers. It drags off all floppy away, and it was like being high-fived by a zombie. I jerked my hands under the cover, and I'm now wide awake. I stare into the inky black and listen intently. I realize I didn't hear my sister breathing. I couldn't hear anything. Oh God, I wanted to hear something, anything. I lie there, not daring to move a muscle, straining my eyes and ears. I was certain there was a person there in the darkness, but I couldn't hear them at all. I was sure they'd speak. They'd have to speak, right? You don't high-five strangers in the night. I waited a while and fell asleep. And when I woke up the next morning, I didn't say anything about it to anyone. I listened to everybody at the breakfast table, and no one mentioned coming to my room or seeing weird strangers in the night. I honestly didn't know what to think about it. I had been wide awake, I knew it. A sleepwalker perhaps, maybe my sister or my mum, but no one I knew was a sleepwalker in the family, and I decided to put it behind me. That night I woke up again, and there's a bit of moonlight, but thanks to the porch, it's a mere sliver on the windowsill behind me. It spent all of its strength just getting there and can illuminate nothing, and this time I felt like I was waiting. I tried not to wait and told myself I woke up in the middle of the night all the time, and was not going to give any more high fives to people at night. I had my arms under the covers and everything. A few minutes go by and I hear my brother shuffle out of his room, and I immediately relaxed. Oh, thank goodness, it was just him. probably going to the bathroom. But instead of walking to the bathroom, which was right across from his room, he went to the end of the hall. Okay, he's getting a drink, fair enough. But then he turned around at the end of the hall and shuffled back. This is where things get weird. He reached the door to my room, then turned around and shuffled back to the end of the hallway, then turned around and shuffled back towards my door. He then did this about 4 to 5 times, and I was getting increasingly more concerned. Finally, I sat up in bed. The shuffling had reached my door once more, and I could see nothing. "Sam?" I asked. "Are you okay?" There was complete silence. My heart started crawling up my throat. And then the shuffling began again, but this time on the other end of the hallway. I fly under the covers, which is where I lied for an hour, while a barefoot ghost shuffled back and forth. My door was open. It could come in, and it could even see me. But you know what? I ended up falling asleep. All it was doing was shuffling, and the sound became tiresome, and I was tired. I guess it wasn't that bad. The next morning I am again left in a conundrum. Do I tell someone? What the hell does one say to something about this? I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't even know what it was. I wasn't even sure I could trust my experience. It was so strange. For the record, my family was one step above Christian fundamentalism. Southern evangelicals believe in a spirit word of black and white. Either a spirit is God's or it's the devil's. There's no middle ground. They also don't tend to believe that ghosts are returned dead, but actors of spiritual anarchy, to confuse the faithful and lead them astray. Well, I was an extremely devout child, and I'd read a lot about the devil, and how it came in groups, and they were destructive, and they caused mayhem. And my spirit thing had exercised in the hallway and high-fived me. I wasn't really sure how I was going to categorize that. I woke up that night wide awake. This time there was no waiting. The shuffling started at the far end of the hallway. It walked up to the door, and it did not stop. It walked into my room. My bedroom's floor plan was like so. My sister's bed towards the inside of the room, and my bed sat in front of the hallway. There was an E-shaped walking space, and my new shuffle body was like, hell yeah, I love to shuffle in pathways, shaped like a capital E. It was summer, and I had thrown off everything but a single thin sheet. This creepy thing began poking me through the sheet. It poked through the side of my arms and legs and hips. It had a lot of fingers, but generally it would poke me on the side it was walking. The fingers were small. I kept hoping I was imagining it. Maybe it was the fan. Let it just be the fan whiffing on the sheets. Did I fall asleep this time? Absolutely not. I lay there still, barely able to breathe. I don't know for how long. I kept hoping my sister would wake up. Eventually the room started lightening. Dawn was coming and I started straining my eyes. Soon it would grow light enough for me to see my tormentor. The shuffling stopped at the head of the bed, and I heard 3 drawn-out sighs in a woman's voice. Each one was identical to the one before, like a recording being played, and just like that, was gone. I launched out of bed, and to my surprise, my sister followed me immediately. I was angry at first, like, "You mean you didn't do anything?" She was 9. I threw myself into my mum's bed and started babbling about ghosts. There were ghosts in my room. It was walking around my bed and touching me, and I sighed, and it high-fived me, and why wasn't my mum looking concerned? Why did she look crabby? "Please stop," she said. "You're going to scare your sister." I turned to my sister, and she stared at me blankly and said nothing. I realized she must have just jumped out of bed because I had disturbed her, not because she had been awoken by the ghosts. This was beside the fact. My mother didn't believe me. I hate to admit this, but I would routinely lie as a child. I'm not talking about mundane activities like whether I had cleaned my room or finished my homework. I'm talking about today I saw a dragon while riding the bus, or I found a magical pool full of fairies. The only thing worse than being disbelieved by my own mother was the realization that I had played myself. I was the boy who cried wolf, but instead of the wolf, it was the shuffle ghost. So that night I prayed before I went to bed, threw on my comforter even though it was uncomfortably warm, and when I woke up suddenly that night, right on the dot, I woke up afraid and mad. Like, let's throw hands. If Mum wasn't going to help me, I had to help myself. Right on schedule, the shuffling begins from the end of the hallway in the room, and the moonlight is starting to pool on the floor, but it's not illuminating and the ghost isn't getting very close to it. Thankfully, no more poking. It's only gotten 3/4 of the way into its cycle when I leap out of bed, ball my hands into fists and stand straight, throw my shoulders back, and this was great. Everything was so far going as planned. I was 11 years old, and nobody is afraid of babies except for smaller babies. The ghost stopped. I could feel it regarding me from the corner. It felt so apathetic. I groped around for something to say and pulled out the verbal equivalent of the housewife who starts throwing flower pots and ballpoint pens at home intruders. "You better not hurt my sister," I said loudly, hoping my sister would wake up. And she didn't. I stood there in silence, feeling dumber by the second. I was going to try and fist fight a ghost? After a few minutes I lay back down, and just like that, the shuffle began again, and I spent the rest of the night wide awake and in despair. Again, as the dawn of the light began to fill the room, and just before I could see anything, the ghost sighed 3 times and was gone. Again I sprang out of bed and marched to my parents' room. My dad had come home the night before. He often worked faraway locations at weeks for a time, so as I tried to tell Mum what happened, he leaned up on an elbow and listened, and he believed me. My mum tried to tell him that I said stories like that all the time. I don't remember the exact gist of the conversation, but he prayed with me and I felt better. That night was Wednesday night, so church. Dad put in a prayer request for me and sang a special song he'd selected and mirrored my fears. I'd felt so seen and cared for, and that night he prayed over my doorway, asking God to put an angel there. He also told me to say if the ghost showed up, and I went to sleep elated. I woke up again that night, this time buzzing with excitement. Was I about to see a ghost fight an angel? The shuffling started as usual at the end of the hallway, and as it grew closer, I was so afraid that I may have to face the ghost myself, and I waited for a sign to see the prayer had worked. Shuffles straight through the door, didn't even hesitate, right beside the bed. This time, the moonlight fell far enough so that I should have seen something walking or pressing into the carpet at least, but my heart sank. The shuffle stopped right beside me. I could feel it regard me. "In the name of Jesus, get out and never come back." There was a huge silence, and a long woman's sigh identical to the ones before, and like that it was gone. I was able to sleep the rest of the night, and the next morning I raced up to my dad and gave him a huge hug and told him it had worked. I have to interject a note here. I'm no longer evangelical, but in fact an atheist. This one experience kept me religious longer than I might have been otherwise. It was also the seed of doubt and thought, because, like a bad horror movie, it didn't end. About 6 in the afternoon, I was sitting in my brother's room, reading a racist primer from the 50s, as one does. I started to feel uncomfortable. I felt like I was being watched, and I couldn't pay attention to the text. I wanted to get up and leave, but when I really thought about it, I got a bit tetchy. No, there's absolutely no reason for me to leave, so I won't. I started staring at the page again, not doing any reading, as the uncomfortable sensation grew on me. And then from the door, a man's sigh, but it was like the woman's high-pitched sigh, but down. I flung the book and sprang, and when I hit the doorway, I passed through a heavy coldness and was stepping through a door. As I walked into the living room, I marveled. Dad was watching Wheel of Fortune turned all the way up, and my brother was on the computer. My mum and sister were cooking and conversing loudly. When I had been in that room, I hadn't heard anything. It had been completely silent. After that, all obvious weird activity dropped off. It didn't end though. A number of small bizarre things followed me into my mid-20s. At one point I had a customer tell me I had an angel and I said, haha, no thanks. I have many theories as to what they are. Mostly I want nothing to do with it, but I'm not going into any haunted houses. I don't trust something that can look or sound like anything it wants. I can't understand its motivations, and that alone is reason to stay far away. I became an atheist and was able to explain away a lot of nonsense I had thought was a miracle when I was a child. But I still haven't been able to explain this. And honestly, I'm kind of grateful. It keeps me humble. I feel like it truly was a rare experience. I've heard ghost stories my whole life from my mum and other family members, but never seen anything myself. That's until my family moved into our house in 2007. Right from the beginning, the house was dark, gloomy, and cold. We moved into the house in July, and I needed a sweater to feel comfortable. We live in Michigan, and July is one of our hottest months. It all started with seeing things from the corner of my eye, but not really seeing what it was, just knowing that it wasn't normal and that nothing should be there. Soon things would not be where I put them, looking on my desk at least 3 to 4 times, and finally finding it 10 minutes later sitting right in the middle of my desk in the open. Little things here and there, but always the feeling of being watched. I could never just walk into a room like a normal person would. I would stop at the doorway and peep inside to make sure that nothing was there, and I found myself tiptoeing and peering more and more. Then I started seeing a black mist. It would almost always come from down the hall from the back of the house. There's 1 bedroom and bathroom down that hall, and go into the kitchen. Our basement door is located in the kitchen, and also straight across from our side entrance door. I was walking through the kitchen to yell something down the basement to my husband, when all of a sudden something came rushing up to me. I fell to my knees, covered my head, and screamed. I could feel it go right over me so fast. One night my husband and I were watching TV, and here comes the mist down the hall and go into the kitchen. I screamed to my husband, "You saw that! You have to have seen it!" He admitted he had seen it before, and also said sometimes he would hear me yell for him, and when he would come to see what I needed, that I would be asleep on the couch or not even home yet. But he insisted that it was definitely my voice. Just a few months ago, my husband and oldest son were in the kitchen talking. My husband leaned against the sink, and my son leaned against the counter. My husband says that he saw a black shadow looking at them from the doorway to the dining room. He looks over to see if our son sees it, and he's just standing there with his mouth open looking right at it. My son says that he was looking at it, and when the shadow realized what they saw, that it backed up from the doorway really fast and vanished. My little guy, he's an 8-year-old, and was a premature baby at 26 weeks, only weighing 2 pounds at birth. He's smaller than an average 8-year-old and more babyish. He has high blood pressure, and when he gets upset, he passes out. So, we keep these things from him. One night he comes to me and says that I'm going crazy, and I ask him why. He says he thinks he just saw a black thing sitting at the dining room table. When he was younger, he would come running to me crying, saying he saw something. I tried to catch it on video, so I set my phone in the kitchen, and I didn't get it on camera, but I did get a voice recording of it talking. So creepy. My grandfather was a labourer, and my grandmother was a housewife, so at the time they tended to travel from place to place until the work was done, and they would move on to the next place. My grandfather was from the Natchez, Mississippi area. They moved into a house that had a fireplace, and the one thing she remembered about this house was that there was a dark spot on the floor, and no matter how hard they scrubbed it, it would never come up. When it rained, it became extremely slippery, and the water that came off it would look like blood. There was always a stench during this time, and nothing would curtail it. Nothing would stop it when the rain came. The stench was so oppressive. So one day my grandmother and grandfather asked the man who owned the house what happened. At first he was quiet, but then he told them that the wife of the previous tenant had hung herself one day when her husband was at work in the fields, and he came home to find her swinging from the rafters, and that she had bled out on that very spot. Well, my grandfather was your typical male who really didn't give in to all the spooky and scary ghost stories. But my grandmother wouldn't drop the subject that she wanted to move, and she was going to move with or without him anyway. The argument broke off, and the next day he went to work out in the fields. A few hours later he left, and the sky got really dark, and there was a thunderstorm on my way, and my grandmother had my father, my uncle, and my aunt, all over them a few years apart, and she went about her daily routine. The rain came in for some reason, and she had to step outside the room. I believe it was the living room, and she left the children in there. She came back and saw this woman that had somehow gotten into the house. She didn't hear a knock on the door, as it was either locked or latched. She would have known if someone had come in. So she called her children over to her because she was scared at the time. The woman was wearing a dingy gown and also had stringy hair and pale skin. Her eyes were coming out of her head as she started walking towards her. So my grandmother, along with 3 small children, ran into the back bedroom, and the woman followed. About this time, my grandmother is fully convinced that this woman is an apparition, and she is afraid for herself, but for her children. About this time, my grandmother is fully convinced that this woman is an apparition, and she is afraid for herself, but for her children as well. The woman comes into the room and stands at the door, and the look on her face is like she was staring through it. Every time my grandmother asks what's wrong, what do you want, and what can I do for you, you'd no reply, because her family had always told her that if an apparition approached her, they were just trying to tell what happened and the reason they left, and trying to make peace. When my grandmother got through speaking, the woman looked up at her, and my grandmother saw the rope burns on her neck, and she let out a very eerie deep moan. My grandmother said that while this was occurring, she kept smelling damp earth and leaves. She also said that before this happened, that spot on the floor, for lack of a better term, was more wet and slippery than usual. This comes from my stepmother, who heard it from her grandmother, and this happened in a place called So-So, Mississippi. This was at a time right before the Great Depression, or maybe the late 1800s, somewhere in that time, but exactly which year I can't say. One day when everyone was out in the field, a stranger started walking up the road towards the house. There's nothing really odd about him, he just doesn't have a whole lot to say. So of course my grandmother's father goes out to meet him and starts a conversation with him and talks a little bit, and decides that he seems reasonably okay, so they invite him inside for a meal. They chat with him for a bit, and they offer him a place to stay for the night as he's passing through. He doesn't act nervous, he is extremely calm. Anyway, towards the evening for some odd reason the man dies, so my grandmother's father sends his son to get the country coroner so that he can get the body of the man that's in the living room, so that they can have him laid out on a table and do the formal proceedings. The man and his sons go and get the coroner, and they lock the door and they tell everyone they'll be back, when they can just keep the door locked until they arrive. It's about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, so they know it's going to take a few hours because they have to go by foot, as there are no horses nor carts to take. At 8 o'clock the doors are locked, the lights are on, and people are just sitting around this time, for lack of a better term. And a thing walks into the room. It's short, stocky, has spikes and a tail and floppy pointed ears, muscular, and maybe the tallest point is 4 feet. It doesn't say a word, and people don't know how it got in. No one heard the door slam. No one heard the door close. They just know that whatever it was you want to call it had eyes, and they are cherry red, and fangs protruding from its mouth. It walked up to the table towards the dead man. It doesn't speak, it doesn't look at anyone. It doesn't make a sound, but simply picks up the man like a rag doll, puts the man on his shoulders and walks through the door and disappears. This happened around 10 years ago, and is something that regularly plays on my mind. I think it happened just past 1 a.m. I was falling asleep, but then I was awoken by the sound of something heavy and metallic clanking against something. It was stressful to be woken up like that, and I was laying in bed wondering what had happened. Not 30 seconds had passed when I heard the sound again. Since I had another chance to hear the sound, I now thought that it sounded like a metal pole or rod smashing against something heavy and dense. It continued. It seemed like it was occurring every 30 seconds or so. I had to take a look outside. It was so weird and I was very curious. My bedroom was on the second floor, and it faced the street. I lived in a residential area back then. It was usually very quiet, especially this late at night. We didn't get much noise from traffic passing either, so it was very odd. I was looking out the window, and for a while I couldn't even figure out where the noise was coming from. It looked as if there were no one on the streets. Well, that's what I thought, until I spotted a figure standing in the middle of the road about 3 houses away. It was a man. He was slightly illuminated between the yellow streetlights. I wondered if he lived in one of the houses that he stood in front of. I hadn't seen him before, and based on the way he stood like a statue in the street, I wouldn't mind not seeing him again either. He was creeping me out. At the man's feet were about 5 garbage bags, all black. They seemed to surround him. It was strange because in our area, we were told by the council to use a yellowish garbage bag. The trash collection workers said if they were not in a yellow bag, they wouldn't take them. This, to me, was a red flag. This is where things get really weird. I thought at one point the garbage bags he was standing over sort of looked like a body. I must have stared at the man for about 10 to 15 minutes, and he didn't move a muscle. The metal sound stopped after a while, and I was too tired to figure out what was happening there, so went to bed. I woke up the next morning late for work, and headed out in a rush. It wasn't until dark when I returned. Just as I was turning my key in the lock, I remembered the events of the night before. My brain literally said, what was going on with the guy last night under the streetlight? I looked across at the home that the man was seemingly stood in front of. Strange thing was, it was pitch black out, and I couldn't see the house I had seen the night before. I was freaked out because I knew I saw the man last night standing in front of a house on my street. Now I couldn't even make out where it was he once stood. Then I figured out why I couldn't see him. There was no streetlight anywhere near that house. I ran upstairs and looked out my window thinking that my eyes had deceived me. But when I pulled the curtain back, my spine went ice cold. There was no streetlight opposite that house. I don't care what anyone says. I saw that man under a yellow streetlight in front of the house. I know it wasn't a dream, and I still have no idea how that happened. All I know is that my life went downhill fast after I laid eyes on him. If anyone has any theories, I'm all ears. I can't get that night out of my head. When I was in high school, my parents decided to relocate our family to a big house in what felt like the middle of nowhere, and I swear to you it was haunted. It's up on a hill, isolated with no neighbors around for miles. Just going up our driveway was pretty long. The previous owner had inherited the place from his parents who had died, but he lost the house after struggling with his addiction. The property was foreclosed, and there was all kinds of weird stuff drawn on the walls when we moved in, so we gutted and renovated the entire home. From what I learned watching Supernatural, renovation is apparently a surefire way to wake up any angry spirits. Well, I was already a pretty paranoid kid, but this new house creeped me out to no end. It had large windows in every room that pointed to the groves. We didn't have any blinds or covers or drapes, so I always felt like I was being watched. I'd be home alone on multiple occasions and hear a cupboard door slam shut very loudly, or hear pounding footsteps going up and down the stairs. I would literally lock myself in the bathroom, the only room in the entire house without a window, until a family member came home when this happened. Just weird noises and always feeling like I'm being watched. The worst experience was when I went to attend a Halloween party in my junior year. I dropped off my sibling at the dance to realize I had left an important part of my costume behind. I drove back home to retrieve said item, and the moment I walked through the door, something just felt wrong. I was home alone, and the house was dark. My body entered fight or fright mode, and for no apparent reason, I felt totally freaked out. So I ran inside, grabbed what I needed, and ran back to my car at record speed. As I raced down the driveway, shaking and crying, my nerves a complete mess, I looked behind me and saw that a dark figure was standing in the window of our house, watching me. Now I don't know how. I knew the figure was there, but my body sensed it before I actually saw him in the window. I'm just glad I got out in time, and I sure as hell didn't sleep that night. I still get freaked out just thinking about it, and I'm glad that I don't live there anymore, because it just had such negative energy about it. I also want to add something completely different, but somewhat related. One of my classmates was obsessed with Michael Jackson, and one day in class he kept telling everyone that Michael Jackson was going to die tomorrow. Sure enough, the next day, the news announced that he had passed.
These are some stories that my grandfather used to tell us when we were kids, about things that happened to him when he was young. Even though I don't know my grandfather is a liar, I was genuinely convinced that all of this really happened. The first is the Nawal. The first story that I remember is that one night when he was at his house, he heard someone knock on the front door. When he came down to see who was calling, he saw by the side of the door that it was a strange creature. Frightened, he went for his Bowie knife, opened the door, and stabbed it in the back, driving it away. The next morning, when he went to the store, the owner told him, "What a blow you gave me." When my grandfather saw the man's back, he had the mark of the Bowie knife. In Mexican folklore, a Nahual is a person that has the ability to transform into an animal. For some time, my grandfather used to work paving roads. One day, while digging in the dirt, his companions quickly began to grab dirt and put it in their pockets. My grandfather, confused, asked them why they were picking it up in such desperation. They shouted at him, "Look, you moron, grab the coins!" And when they finished, they fled. According to my grandfather, it was not his luck to see the coins. It was an old belief that treasures could only be seen by the people for whom they were intended. So if something wasn't meant for you, you weren't allowed to see it. So later, while walking in the streets, my grandfather found a pot full of coal. He took it to his house and left it there for a few days, but because it smelt so bad, he went to a river near the house and threw it in there. After that, one of his relatives visited him. When he learned what happened with the pot, he told him, "Why did you throw it away? The pot had gold inside. What you should have done is put it by your door. If it's meant for someone in your family, you could have given the gold to them, and they would have spent it on something for you." My grandfather quickly returned to the river to look for the pot, but of course it was no longer there. My grandfather told us that one day a priest visited his home, and he forgot a book there. One of his cousins read it and told my great-grandfather that it was prophecies for the future. Here it says that future people will travel under the earth, so like the subway. That all the water you see here is going to disappear. Back in the day, Mexico City was full of water, and nowadays we struggle for it. That at the end of times, the mule is going to give birth, etc. I don't remember what happened to the book, but I think the priest did come back for it. Later, when my grandfather was a child, he was in his home when he saw how a tied-up dead man fell from the roof directly to the ground. Scared, he told my great-grandmother, and when they went to the location, there was no body there to be found.
This happened to my father when he was a younger man, and a great-uncle. They had decided to go drinking and decided to go to this local church Their mother and aunt told them not to do it, but the alcohol, of course, is sitting in, and they wanted to have some fun. So they walk a couple of miles and start beating and banging on the piano, turning the lights on and off. When all of a sudden, the lights get shut off, but not by my uncle or my father, but mysteriously just cut off. And when they do, my father, who is beating and banging the piano, feels an iron grip grab his legs, and it doesn't let go of him for a few minutes. But when it finally does, they are both incredibly sober. So they take a moment to run to the door, but it won't open. They claim it's like an iron bar in front of it, keeping it shut. They sober up even more, and when the door is finally released and they can leave, they run the 2 miles back home whiter than cotton, and that was the first and last time they ever decided to mess around in church. My mother and stepfather bought a house in a 70s era suburb in the late 90s. I was about 13 at the time and already having a lot of issues with depression. Typical teenager stuff. Things were tense between my older brother and my stepdad, and I wasn't having the best time with parents in general either. So we moved into this house. It seemed fine. I had already had some unexplained experiences prior to this in other houses we lived in for as far back as I can remember, and I was looking forward to perhaps not having to deal with that again. Oh man, it did not go down like that. The first thing I remember was one night around 5 or 6. My parents hadn't come home from work yet. It was dark out already, being winter in Canada, and I was sitting in the living room on the main floor and started hearing muffled voices talking. It sounded like an old man and a little girl having a conversation. I could hear the gravelly tone of his voice and the high-pitched sing-song quality of hers. But as usual in these stories, I couldn't tell what exactly they were saying. I walked to the basement stairs and leaned over the railing to see what was going on. Where was it coming from? It was definitely from down there, where the dark, creepy laundry and storage room was. "Hello?" I yelled down. The voices ceased immediately. Good enough. I had no interest to investigate. It happened a few more times, only when I was alone at night. This didn't really scare me. It could be worse, right? So yeah, it got worse. As my mental health started slipping further into depression land, my experiences became interesting. More than once, I would hear extremely loud pounding in the laundry room. It sounded like someone was throwing haymakers at the washing machine, trying to punch a hole through it. Just that hollow, metallic bang, 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 over and over again. The first time it happened, it scared the cap out of me. I'm not easily startled, but it was so loud and so intense that I had to go check. The terrific pounding didn't stop until I made it down the basement stairs and stood in the doorway of the laundry room. Then it stopped immediately. I turned on the light, checked the laundry machine, and they were empty and not running. I even called my mum to ask about it. She said no one was doing laundry and it was probably nothing. The second time it happened, again I was alone. I ran down to check. This time, I was gonna figure it out. Nope. Same story. It stopped as soon as I got to the door. The sound was violent and extremely loud, and I was not impressed. So I told it to shut the hell up and went back upstairs. It didn't happen again after that. So awesome. I sure told it, right? No. I was talking on the cordless phone to one of my friends. We had been chatting for about a half hour when all of a sudden this loud static noise cuts off the conversation, and a guttural voice sounded like it was gargling and talking unintelligibly for about 10 seconds, with loud static accompanying the whole time. Then it cut out, and I was back with my friend. She immediately asked, "What the hell was that?" and I nearly crapped myself. I didn't think she would hear it on her end, but she absolutely did, and described it to me before I said anything to her. So that's cool. Right on. No biggie. One night she came over to sleep. Because my parents were out of town, and because of my crippling depression, they didn't trust me by myself. So they greenlit her for staying over. Everything was normal until next morning. She slept on the couch in the living room, and I slept in my bed. I got up to go to the bathroom when I woke up that morning. When I finished and came out, I went into my room to change. On my dresser, one of my candles was lit. My friend was still sleeping on the couch, and she was not the type to play pranks. I wasn't scared about ghosts at that point. I was just pissed that something started a fire. That's just dangerous, and no one would believe me if I said I didn't do it. So I was miffed. I told whatever it was that it can't be starting fires, house rules, and it never happened again. Many times I would be laying in bed at night, staring into the dark, not able to sleep. The dark plays tricks, I know this. But this was still a little weird to me. I heard shuffling in my closet, like someone was going through a box of my stuff. The closet door was open, and I was looking in. It was dark, but I could see something on the top shelf moving. I turn on the light, and there's nothing. This occurrence kept happening at least once every week. I once woke up in the middle of the night freezing. My blankets were down by my feet, which in itself isn't that unusual. So I just grab and pull it up, but it didn't work. I yanked hard on them, and it felt like the blanket was caught perhaps. I used all my strength to pull the goddamn blanket and it wouldn't budge. At that point I got scared and decided to go back to sleep without the blanket. I didn't open my eyes during the entire ordeal, and I didn't want to. After that night, I felt my blanket slowly being pulled off me a few times, and I snatched it right back as soon as it started. Not today, asshole. So many times in the night I would wake up startled and see someone standing at the end of my bed. Whoever it was had long hair, I assume, as the head, neck and shoulders weren't defined, but it sure was male. He was huge, 6'4" and beefy. I could only ever see the silhouette, but it was always the same one. Once I watched it rise like it was coming out of the floor. That was interesting. I just rolled over and closed my eyes. Whatever, dude, creep away, I'm tired. It wasn't just the house either. It felt like it was the entire neighborhood that was a little touched. I'd go on walks at night to stabilize myself and keep myself out of trouble, but also to smoke weed and cigarettes, or drink. So I'm walking down a cement path that goes behind people's houses, like a dog walking path. People's back gates would open onto this path, and you can walk all over the neighborhood without really hitting any streets. It was like a back path maze. About 2 houses down from mine, these people had a wooden gate and a set of about 3 stairs to go into the yard. I'd sit on those stairs a lot and just smoke and chill, trying to center myself mentally. One night, I was going to sit on them as normal, and I got close enough to see. It looked like there was a 2-year-old sitting on the stairs. I got weirded out, because what the hell is a kid at that age doing alone outside at this time of night? I got closer and noticed that this kid didn't have a friggin' head. I could see him sitting there, his hands on his lap, overall striped shirt, and nothing above his neck. He was solid like a real person, and I could see the neck meat where it looked like his head was severed. No blood though, so I kept walking. There were parks within stumbling distance of my house that all connected to each other. The first park had a playground, the next one it connected to had an elementary school, and the third was just trees and grass. So I'm walking home at 11 p.m. Snow on the ground at -20 Celsius. Low clouds, so the light of the city reflected back and illuminated everything better than a full moon ever could. It was damn near daylight out there, and I could see from one end of the park to the other. At the furthest end, I saw a black form moving quickly. I figured it was a cat or rabbit or something, and then a second, and then a third. I started getting worried it was coyotes. They moved fast and were definitely running. They crossed back and forth and began heading in my direction. They crossed over each other as they got closer, and over the span of about 10 seconds, they had gotten about halfway to me. Then they disappeared. At first, I thought maybe they dove under some new snow, or something like that. But the entire time I didn't hear a sound, no paw on crunchy snow, no animal calls, nothing. After that, I started getting a really bad feeling any time I even looked into the park from the street. Fast forward to when I was 23, and had to move back there after screwing up my life. I ended up having to stay in the bedroom in the basement, as they had converted my old room into a study. I'm sitting at my desk reading, when I hear something rustling in my closet. Ah, memories. It seriously sounded like there was a raccoon tossing things looking for food. So I get up and turn on the light. The noise persists, which confused me, as I'm used to things stopping when I take notice. So I go into the closet and start hauling everything out, convinced I was going to find a mouse or something. The entire time I searched that closet, these noises continued, and after hauling the last thing out and scouring for signs of poop or holes, the noises finally stopped. I have many other stories about places I've lived in, but these have been some of the more intense. So about 6 months after I bought our house, I started noticing something odd. Every once in a while, I would catch sight of something out of the corner of my eye, and always assume it was my cat, since it was the same size and shape, and moved like a cat. However, I would realize a few seconds later that my cat was in the yard or another room. It would try to look back, but nothing was ever there. It was so quick I always dismissed it. Once at night, I saw it on the ceiling, and I about had a heart attack. I would also hear things in the house. I assumed my husband was doing the dishes due to the clinking in the sink, but then I would realize he was in the bedroom, and the kitchen was empty. It took about a year for my husband and I to start wondering aloud if we were actually seeing things, or if something dubious was up. Turns out he was seeing stuff too. Just little flashes here and there. My husband said he heard some stuff too on his days off, when no one was home. The biggest moment was when I woke up in the middle of the night, and saw my cat curled up on my side table. I heard him purr. His fur looked darker, and his purr was lower, but I was half asleep and didn't notice. I went to the bathroom, and on my way I passed my sleeping cat in the hallway. It actually took me a few seconds, but I literally felt my chest turn cold. I went back into my bedroom and saw that the bedside table was empty. We're pretty sure we have a ghost cat in our house. The only thing I know about the previous owners was that he was put into a mental hospital. I've had to routine a bunch of paperwork back over to him over the years, because his affairs were very clearly not taken care of when he was hospitalized. My theory is that he had a cat that got lost in the shuffle, and it's still waiting for him to come home.